Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still don't sleep well some nights. It's been nearly 18 years since it happened, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything supernatural, but what I saw that night in July 2005 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I was going through a rough patch back then. My wife and I had separated, and I was living with my 13-year-old son in Crescent City, California. We were trying to work things out through counseling, which meant weekly late-night drives to Medford, Oregon and back. That particular night was especially draining. We'd gone deep into some painful stuff during the session, and my head was swimming with thoughts on the drive back. Around midnight, I pulled into the agricultural checkpoint on Highway 199. Locals just call it the bug station. I was exhausted, so I decided to take a quick nap before finishing the drive home. I reclined my seat, set my phone alarm for 30 minutes, and dozed off almost immediately. When I woke up, the clock on my dashboard read 12:20. The bug station was completely deserted, just my old Chevy dually sitting there under the fluorescent lights. I splashed some cold water on my face from a bottle I kept in the truck, ate a granola bar, and got back on the road. Highway 199 between Crescent City and Grants Pass is no joke, especially at night. It's this narrow, winding road that snakes through Smith River Canyon. Pitch black except for your headlights, with steep drop-offs and hardly any guardrails in some sections. I'd driven it enough times to know it well, but it still demanded your full attention. My truck was an older Chevy dually, not the ideal vehicle for those tight curves. The dual rear wheels made it wider than a normal pickup, and it handled like a boat sometimes. But it was reliable, and I needed something sturdy for hauling my tools for work. It had my high beams on, cutting through the darkness as I navigated the turns. The radio was playing softly, some classic rock station that kept fading in and out as I moved through the canyon. I remember I'd just passed through one of the tunnels and was heading into a series of S-curves. The road straightened briefly, and that's when I saw it. On the opposite shoulder of the road, walking away from me, was the largest figure I've ever seen in my life. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing up, a really tall hiker, but within a split second I knew it wasn't either of those things. What I was looking at was something I'd only ever seen in documentaries or heard about in stories. A Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before that night, I'd have thought they were full of crap or had seen a bear in poor lighting. But what I saw was clear as day in my headlights. I got a good solid 4-second look at it as I approached and passed by. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but it was enough time for my brain to photograph every detail. This thing was massive, easily over 8 feet tall. I'm 6'2" myself, and it towered over what my height would be standing there. The bulk of it was just as impressive, had to be 500 to 800 pounds, with a frame that made a linebacker look like a child. The shoulders were the widest part, impossibly broad and muscular, with almost no visible neck. Its head seemed to just sit directly between those shoulders, conical-shaped and slightly pointed at the top. The hair covering its body is what really sticks in my memory. It wasn't like fur exactly, more like long, tangled hair, similar to what you'd see on a llama. Primarily a light grey or charcoal color, but with darker patches underneath where the hair was thinner. It wasn't a uniform color all over, which struck me as odd at the time. The hair moved slightly as it walked, swaying with each step. Its hands and feet were clearly visible, which is something I wasn't expecting. The hands were huge, with long fingers, hanging at its sides as it walked. The feet were wide, with what looked like tough soles, built for traversing rough terrain. It walked with purpose, a steady, deliberate gait that was surprisingly smooth for something so large. The whole sighting happened so fast. I was doing about 45 miles per hour through that section, and it never turned to look at me. It just kept walking along the shoulder, headed north while I was driving south. As I passed it, my first instinct was to slam on the brakes, turn around, and go back for another look. I actually took my foot off the gas, ready to brake. But then reality set in. I was on a narrow, winding mountain road in the middle of the night with no cell service. The road at that point had a steep cliff on one side and a rock wall on the other. There was nowhere safe to turn my oversized truck around, and even if I could, what exactly was I planning to do? Chase after it, take a picture with my crappy flip phone in the dark, confront an 8-foot-tall, 800-pound creature by myself? So I kept driving, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing in my rearview mirror until the road curved, and the spot where I'd seen it disappeared from view. The rest of the drive home is a blur. I remember turning the radio off and opening the window, despite the cold night air. I needed to feel alert, present. When I got home, my son was asleep. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't wake him up to tell him. What father wants his kid to think he's losing his mind? I made coffee and watched the sunrise, replaying those 4 seconds over and over in my head, checking for any detail that might reveal it was just a man in a suit or my eyes playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. The next day at work, I finally told a co-worker, a guy who'd lived in the area his whole life. I figured if anyone would take me seriously, it would be a local. I was wrong. He laughed and said, "You've only been here 8 months and already seen Bigfoot. Some people live here their whole lives hoping for that." Then he went on to tell me about all the Bigfoot sightings in the area over the years, like it was some kind of local folklore, not something real. I dropped it after that. I didn't tell anyone else for a long time. Who would believe me? A stressed out, sleep-deprived guy going through a divorce sees Bigfoot on a dark road in the middle of the night. I wouldn't believe me either. But in the years since, I've done research. What I saw matches descriptions of what some researchers call the tropical type of Sasquatch, or something related to Gigantopithecus. The height, the build, the coloration, it all fits. I've read accounts from other people who've had sightings in that same area, describing similar features. I'm not alone in what I saw. I've driven that stretch of Highway 199 hundreds of times since that night. Sometimes I slow down near that spot, scanning the trees and the road shoulders. I've never seen it again. Part of me hopes I never do, while another part desperately wants confirmation that I didn't imagine it. The thing that haunts me most isn't just that I saw something that supposedly doesn't exist. It's the casualness of the encounter. This creature wasn't hiding. It wasn't startled by my truck or my headlights. It was just walking, like it had every right to be there. Like it was going somewhere specific with a purpose in mind. That's what makes me think about it the most. The idea that while we're all going about our daily lives, there could be these intelligent, massive beings living alongside us, mostly unseen, following their own paths that occasionally intersect with ours. Sometimes when I'm camping or hiking in those mountains now, I get the feeling I'm being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up for no reason. A silence will fall in the forest. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just complete stillness. And I wonder if it's out there, watching me from the trees, as clearly as I saw it that night on the highway. I've made peace with the fact that most people won't believe my story. That's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, and it wasn't my imagination. It was something else entirely. Something that makes me question how much we really know about the world we live in. That 4-second encounter changed me. Not in any dramatic way that others would notice, but inside. I look at forests differently now. I listen more carefully to stories that seem impossible. And sometimes, when I'm driving that highway late at night, I keep my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, afraid of what might be standing in the darkness just beyond my headlights. Story 2. I still don't know what I saw that day, and it haunts me. I've spent almost 20 years trying to make sense of it, but I can't. I'm not some crazy person looking for attention. I've served as a Marine, a firefighter, and a state police officer. I've seen a lot of strange things in my life, but nothing like this. It was August 16th, 2004. Remember the date clearly because I'd just retired the week before and was taking a solo drive to clear my head. I was heading east on Route 80 in California, making my way toward Donner Pass. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, about 75 degrees. I had the windows down, enjoying the mountain air. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, I'd just passed the truck inspection station and that state work yard they have out there. I was crossing over one of those highway bridges that spans a ravine when something caught my eye down below. I don't know why I looked down at that exact moment. Maybe movement or a shadow. But I did. About 300 yards south of the bridge, I saw something step out from the tree line on the west bank of the ravine. At first, my brain tried to process it as a bear, but within seconds I knew that wasn't right. This thing was standing upright, walking on 2 legs with a stride that was unmistakably purposeful. I immediately pulled over. 20+ years in law enforcement teaches you to trust your instincts, and mine was screaming that something wasn't right. I parked on the shoulder, grabbed my binoculars from the glove compartment, old habits die hard, and got out to get a better look. What I saw through those lenses made my blood run cold. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. This figure stood at least 8 feet tall, and I'm not exaggerating that height. I've been trained to estimate distances and sizes accurately. It had broad, humanoid shoulders, but was impossibly thin, almost lanky. But the most disturbing thing was its appearance. It was completely, utterly black. Not dark-skinned, not wearing black clothes. Black, like a void. No distinguishable features, no clothing lines, nothing. Just this tall, black figure. It moved with these long, smooth strides across the ravine, arms swinging slightly at its sides. The movements were fluid but odd, like watching someone walk underwater in slow motion, but at normal speed, if that makes any sense. Then, as I was trying to process what I was seeing, a second figure emerged from the same spot in the tree line. This one was smaller, maybe 6 feet tall, but with the same impossible black appearance. It followed the first one, staying about 30 feet behind and slightly to the south. Same fluid movement, same featureless appearance. I watched, completely frozen, as they both crossed the stream in the middle of the ravine. The water didn't seem to affect them at all. They didn't slow down, didn't splash, just walked straight through. Then they disappeared into the trees on the eastern side. The whole thing lasted maybe 45 seconds, but it felt like hours. I kept expecting them to look up at the highway or acknowledge each other, but they never did. They moved with this eerie precision, like they were following some predetermined path. No communication between them, no hesitation, no reaction to their surroundings. After they disappeared, I stayed there for another 10 minutes, scanning the area with my binoculars, but there was no sign of them. I kept thinking they'd emerge somewhere else, but they never did. I finally got back in my car and sat there, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I've been in combat. I've pulled people from burning buildings. I've faced down armed suspects, but this was different. It wasn't immediately threatening, but it was deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way I can't fully explain. The more I thought about it, the more details started to bother me. This was remote wilderness. The nearest town was miles away. There were no hiking trails nearby that I knew of. If these were people, what were they doing out there? And where was their gear? No backpacks, no water bottles, no clothing appropriate for hiking through rugged terrain. And that blackness. It wasn't like they were wearing black suits or had black skin. It was like they absorbed light. There was a slight shimmer to them, almost like the way heat distorts air above hot pavement, but their color never varied. Face, hands, entire body. All the same uniform black. After sitting in my car for probably 20 minutes, I decided to drive down to the nearest exit and try to find a way back to that area. I wanted to see if I could find tracks or any evidence of what passed through. It took me almost an hour to find a service road that would get me somewhat close, but the terrain was too difficult to reach the exact spot from that direction without proper hiking gear, which I didn't have. I drove back up to the highway bridge and pulled over again, scanning the ravine with my binoculars. Nothing. Not a trace of whatever I'd seen. I've spent years turning this over in my mind. With my background, I'm trained to look for logical explanations. Could they have been hikers in some kind of specialized gear? The movements were too fluid, too inhuman. The height of the first figure rules out most humans. And why would hikers be dressed in head-to-toe black in August heat? Could they have been some unknown animal? I've spent decades outdoors in California. I know every native species. Nothing matches what I saw. The upright posture, the shoulders, the proportions, all wrong for any known animal. Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I've always been skeptical of those stories, but what I saw wasn't like the descriptions I've heard. These things weren't hairy or bulky. They were smooth, slender, and that uniform blackness doesn't match any Bigfoot account I've ever read. Some kind of military test with specialized suits. Maybe. But why conduct tests in an area visible from a major highway? And what technology could make someone move like that? I've only told a few people about this over the years. My ex-wife thought I was having some kind of stress reaction to retirement. One of my old police buddies suggested maybe I'd seen shadows cast by clouds moving across the ravine. Another friend from the Marines listened carefully and just said, "There are things out there we don't understand, Marcus." I went back to that spot twice more in the years following. Once in 2006 and again in 2011. Nothing looked unusual. It was just a normal ravine with trees and a stream. No strange feelings, no sightings, nothing out of place. What bothers me most, even now, is the purposefulness of their movement. They weren't wandering or exploring, they were traveling, going from point A to point B. Where were they coming from? Where were they going? And why take such a direct route across open terrain where they could be seen from the highway? The second figure especially troubles me. Why was it following at that exact distance? Why slightly offset to the south? Was it subordinate to the first? Were they maintaining some kind of formation? The precision suggested intelligence and planning, and I can't shake the feeling that I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, something that doesn't belong in our world or our understanding of it. I'm 72 years old now. I've had a full career serving my country and my community. I've seen people at their best and their worst. I've witnessed tragedy and heroism. I consider myself a rational person grounded in reality. But on August 16th, 2004, I saw something that defies explanation, something that makes me question what else might be moving through our world, just out of sight, following paths and purposes we know nothing about. Sometimes when I'm driving on remote highways, I find myself scanning the landscape, watching the tree lines and ravines. I've never seen anything like it again, but I'm always looking now, always aware that there might be things moving out there, things that don't care if we see them because they're just passing through. I don't know what those figures were. I don't know if they were something from this world or somewhere else. All I know is what I saw that day was real. And no explanation I've considered in 20 years makes any sense. So I'm sharing this now because I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to die with me. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe someone has answers I don't. Or maybe this is just one of those mysteries we'll never solve. A brief glimpse into something beyond our understanding that appeared for less than a minute and then continued on its way, leaving nothing behind but questions. Story 3 dots. I've been sitting on this story for over 30 years, not sure if I should even share it. I'm still not convinced of what I saw that evening in British Columbia, but I know it wasn't normal. I've always been the skeptical type, the kind of guy who rolls his eyes at every Bigfoot or Sasquatch story. I used to think people who claimed to see these things were either lying or confused. Now, I'm not so damn sure anymore. This happened back in the early 90s when I was driving my buddy's brand new Isuzu Trooper from Seattle all the way up to Anchorage. My friend had just bought it, but couldn't make the drive himself, so I volunteered since I needed to get up to Alaska anyway for a job opportunity. The Alcan Highway is no joke. Almost 2,000 miles of remote road cutting through some of the most isolated wilderness in North America. I'd been on the road for a couple days already when this happened. I was about 45 minutes from Laird Hot Springs Provincial Park in British Columbia. If you've never driven that stretch, it's incredibly remote. You can go hours without seeing another vehicle. The section I was on was mostly straight, but it had these features locals call whoop-de-doos, basically a series of rolling hills that make it impossible to see very far ahead. You crest one hill, dip down into a valley, then up over another hill. When you're in the valleys between hills, you can't see the horizon at all. It was around 6 in the evening, early winter, with a light dusting of snow on the ground, but the road itself was clear. I was doing about 50 miles per hour. The first time I noticed something, I was coming up over one of these hills. Just caught a glimpse of something dark standing at the tree line on the right side of the road. I remember thinking it was probably a moose. They're everywhere up there, and they're huge. But something about it didn't register right in my brain. When I dipped into the next valley, I lost sight of whatever it was. As I crested the next hill, I saw it again. This time a bit closer, since I'd been driving toward it. Still on the right side where the mountains rise up. That's when I realized it wasn't a moose. It was standing on 2 legs. My first thought was, oh, it's just a person. But who the hell would be standing out there miles from anywhere as darkness was coming on? I kept driving, up and down through these whoop-de-doos, catching glimpses of this figure each time I got to a high point. With each hill I crested, I got closer, and things started getting weirder. This wasn't a person. It was way too big. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing was towering. Had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. As I got within about a quarter mile, I slowed down a bit. The sun was getting low, but there was still enough light to see clearly. That's when I noticed it was covered in fur, a brownish color with lighter patches around the edges. It seemed to be pulling branches from a tree, just yanking them down like they were nothing. I've spent my whole life outdoors. I've seen bears, moose, elk, every major North American mammal in the wild. This wasn't any of those. Bears don't stand like that, and it was too bulky for a person in a coat. The proportions were all wrong. When I got within maybe half a mile, the thing suddenly stopped what it was doing. I swear it looked right at me. My stomach dropped. I had this overwhelming feeling of being seen, really seen, by something intelligent. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't like when a deer notices your car. This was different. Then it started moving. Not running exactly, but these huge, deliberate strides across the road toward the left side, where there was a steep drop-off down to a stream. It crossed the entire road in what seemed like 3 or 4 steps, and then just disappeared over the edge of this cliff. I slowed down even more, feeling this mix of curiosity and dread. Part of me wanted to just gun it and get the hell out of there, but another part needed to know what I'd just seen. When I reached the spot where it had crossed, I pulled over. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, engine running, trying to decide if getting out was the stupidest idea I'd ever had. The rational part of my brain kept saying it was probably just a bear walking oddly, or maybe some weirdo in the woods, but I knew better. Finally, I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was cold and still, that kind of mountain silence that's so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I walked over to where I thought the thing had been standing by the trees. There was a circular area about 15 feet across where the snow was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, the snow was too light for that, but the ground was clearly trampled. Broken branches lay scattered around, some of them pretty thick. I picked one up that was maybe 2 inches in diameter. It had been snapped clean off, not cut. It would take serious strength to do that. I followed the disturbance to where it led across the road. When I reached the cliff edge, I shined my flashlight down. It wasn't a sheer drop, but a steep slope leading down to the stream about 60 feet below. I could see where something large had descended. Broken brush, disturbed snow, small trees bent over. Whatever went down there was heavy. Standing there at the edge, I felt exposed. The hairs on my neck stood up. I had this overwhelming feeling I was being watched. If you've ever had a predator stare at you in the woods, you know the feeling. It's primal. I decided to wait. Don't ask me why. Maybe I needed more confirmation of what I'd seen. Maybe I just couldn't believe it. I got back in the Trooper, but left the engine off. 20 minutes passed with nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a sound that still visits me in dreams sometimes. It started as a low howl that rose into something between a scream and a roar. It wasn't a wolf or a bear or any animal I'd ever heard. It came from the woods on the other side of the stream. The sound echoed off the mountains, making it hard to pinpoint exactly where it came from, but it was close. Too close. I was about to start the engine when I noticed movement in the brush below. The alders down there, which stand maybe 15 to 20 feet tall, started moving, not like when wind blows through them, but being physically pushed aside. I watched as they were flattened in a straight line, one after another, as something massive moved through them. Whatever it was heading upstream, away from the road. I could track its progress by watching the tops of the alders being pressed down in sequence, like watching the wake of an invisible boat. This went on for maybe 100 yards before whatever was making the path disappeared into thicker forest. I started the Trooper and got the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove non-stop for the next 2 hours until I reached the next town with a motel. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear walking on its hind legs? Maybe, but not for that distance or with that gait. A person in some kind of costume, out there miles from anywhere. No way. A moose. Absolutely not. The movement and shape were all wrong. The next morning I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But then I noticed mud and pine needles on my boots from where I'd stood at the cliff edge. And I remembered the sound. That howl scream that didn't belong to anything I recognized. I've spent the last 30 years trying to explain what I saw that evening. I've read about misidentifications, about how the human mind plays tricks in low light. I've looked at photos of bears standing upright. None of it fits. I'm still skeptical about Bigfoot. I don't watch those TV shows or join the forums, but I know what I saw wasn't something easily explained. It walked like a person, but was far too large. It had the strength to snap branches that would take me serious effort to break. And whatever was moving through those alders was massive and powerful. The thing that gets me most, though, was that feeling of being watched, of being recognized. That wasn't an animal's awareness. There was something disturbingly human in that moment, when it stopped and looked at me. I never reported this officially. Who would I tell? What would I say? I saw something big and furry that walked on 2 legs. I'd sound crazy. So I kept it to myself until now. To this day, When I hear stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, I don't laugh anymore. I don't know what's out there in the remote parts of North America, but I know there are things in those mountains and forests that don't fit neatly into the categories we've made. I still drive that stretch of the Alcan occasionally. Every time I pass that spot, I slow down and look at the tree line. I've never seen anything again, but I always have this feeling, this certainty, that something is watching from just beyond the trees, something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for decades now. What happened to me in the Sierra National Forest back in '63 has haunted me all these years, and I've only told a handful of people, my wife, my brother, and a couple hunting buddies who didn't believe me anyway. I'm 79 now and figure I might as well put it down somewhere before I'm gone. It was early October, 1963. I was 21 then, had been hunting since I was 12 with my dad and uncles. This particular trip, I went alone. Had my trusty Winchester 30-06, enough supplies for 3 days, and my dad's old army surplus tent. The plan was simple. Get deep into the Sierras, bag a nice buck, and enjoy some solitude before winter set in. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, parked at this little-known access point my uncle had shown me years earlier, hiked about 4 miles in before dark, set up camp near a small creek. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies. Fall in the Sierras is something special. The aspens were turning golden, and there was this earthy smell in the air, like the forest was preparing for sleep. Saturday morning, I woke up before dawn, ate some jerky, drank coffee from my thermos, and packed a small lunch. I knew this particular ridge about a mile from my camp, where deer often passed through early morning. It overlooked a meadow to the east, so you'd get the sun coming up behind any deer that might be feeding there. Perfect setup. I left camp around 5:30, still pitch black, used my flashlight sparingly, just enough to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. Didn't want to spook any game. The forest was dead quiet, except for the occasional owl and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Got to my spot around 6. It was a fallen log at the edge of a steep embankment, about 30 feet above a clearing. I had a good view of several game trails that converged in the meadow below. Behind me was dense forest, mostly pines, some manzanita brush, perfect spot for ambushing deer coming down for their morning feed. I settled in, back against a large pine, rifle across my lap. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten, not enough to see clearly, but enough to make out shapes and movements. I remember feeling completely at peace. No work stress, no bills, no noise, just me and the forest. As the light improved, I spotted 2 does with a fawn moving cautiously through the meadow. Beautiful animals, but I was holding out for a buck. They fed for about 20 minutes before disappearing back into the trees. Around 7:30, a young forkhorn came through, but again, too small to take. The hours passed slowly. By 10, the sun was well up, and I figured most deer activity would be done until evening. Still, I decided to stay put. Sometimes you get lucky with a midday wanderer. I ate half my sandwich, took small sips from my canteen. The temperature had risen to maybe 65 degrees, warm enough that I removed my jacket. I must have dozed off sometime around 11. I hadn't slept well the night before. Too excited about the hunt, I guess. The warmth of the sun, the quiet of the forest, my full stomach. It all conspired against my vigilance. I don't know how long I was out, but what woke me wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. You know that sensation when someone's watching you, that prickle on the back of your neck. That's what jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open, and I had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat up slowly, tightened my grip on my rifle. The sun was high overhead now. Must have been around 1 in the afternoon. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't explain why. The forest seemed normal. Birds were chirping. Nothing looked out of place. Then I saw it. About 10 feet away, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, something large was moving. My first thought was bear, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't move like that. This was upright, walking away from me at an angle, moving through the trees with a smoothness that seemed impossible for something so big. "Hey!" I called out, thinking it might be another hunter. No response. The figure just kept moving, picking up pace. I raised my rifle instinctively but didn't aim. As the figure moved between two large pines, I got my first clear look, and my blood ran cold. This wasn't human, not even close. It was covered in hair, a dark, grayish-black color, thick and matted in places. I could only see it from the waist up because there were some fallen logs between us, but what I saw was massive. The shoulders were incredibly broad and muscular, nothing like a human's proportions. The head is what really got me, though. It wasn't round like ours. It had this pointed quality toward the back, almost conical, but not quite. The thing was big, really big. I'm 6 foot myself, and this creature was at least 6'6", probably more. And the way it moved, that's what still haunts me. Despite its size, it made virtually no sound. The forest floor was covered with dry pine needles, twigs, fallen branches. Walking quietly through that is nearly impossible. But this thing, it was like it knew exactly where to place each foot. I was frozen, completely paralyzed with a fear I'd never experienced before or since. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't even call out again. The creature disappeared into the thicker forest within seconds, moving with purpose, but not exactly running. After it vanished, I sat there for what felt like forever, rifle clutched so tight my knuckles were white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Bear? No way. Man in a suit, out here, miles from anywhere, and no human could move that quietly through dense underbrush. When I finally got the courage to move, I approached the spot where I'd seen it. The ground was hard and covered with pine needles, so I couldn't find any clear footprints, but there was a broken branch about 7 feet up on one of the trees, freshly broken, with sap still oozing. I'm 6 foot and couldn't reach it without jumping. I didn't stay to investigate further. Something primal in me just wanted to get the hell out of there. I gathered my gear with shaking hands and started back toward camp, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snapping twig made me jump. I abandoned the idea of a clean, quiet walk. I just wanted distance. When I reached camp, I didn't even take time to rest. Packed everything in record time, not caring about neatness or organization, just stuffed it all in my backpack and started the hike back to my truck. 4 miles never felt so long. I kept my rifle ready the entire time, safety off. Something my dad would have scolded me for. Made it back to my truck around 4:30 and got the hell out of there. Drove straight home, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way. Didn't even stop for dinner, though. I was starving. That night I couldn't sleep, kept replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering if I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. Whatever I saw was real, solid, and definitely not human. For years, I didn't tell anyone except my wife, who probably thought I'd had some kind of hallucination from dehydration or something. Then, in 1967, I saw a news report about Roger Patterson's film footage from Bluff Creek. Nearly fell out of my chair. The creature in that film, the way it moved, its proportions, even that strange pointed head shape, was identical to what I'd seen in the Sierras. I've spent decades wondering about that day. Was it watching me sleep? How long had it been there? Why didn't it hurt me when it had every opportunity? I've read everything I could find about similar encounters since then, and mine fits the pattern of dozens of others. What strikes me most, looking back, wasn't just the creature's appearance, but its behavior. There was an intelligence there. It moved away deliberately, quietly, like it didn't want a confrontation. Almost respectful in a strange way. It could have easily attacked me while I slept, but it chose to leave when I woke up. I never went hunting alone again after that. Always had at least one buddy with me. And I never went back to that particular spot in the Sierras, though I've hunted other areas since. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, I've spent 56 years trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But it was. Something was in those woods with me that day. Something science can't explain. Not a bear, not a man. Something else. Sometimes I still wake up with that feeling, that prickle on the back of my neck like I'm being watched. And in those moments between sleep and wakefulness, I'm right back there on that log, locking eyes with something that shouldn't exist. Story 5. I've never really told this story in full detail before. It's something that stuck with me for years, and even though I was just 12 at the time, the memories are so vivid it could have happened yesterday. I've tried to rationalize it, but I can't explain what we saw that summer in Myakka City. This happened back when I was visiting my cousin in Florida. He was 15, 3 years older than me, and I thought he was the coolest person ever. His family lived on this property at the edge of cattle country in Myakka City. If you don't know the area, it's basically where civilization starts to fade into these vast flatlands and swampy areas. Their house wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story ranch-style place with a big yard that eventually gave way to wild Florida landscape. I was supposed to stay for 2 weeks during summer break. My parents thought it would be good for me to spend time away from video games and actually be outdoors for once. The first few days were pretty normal, swimming in their above-ground pool, riding bikes down the dirt roads, and shooting his BB gun at cans. They had me sleeping in the front room on this fold-out couch. It wasn't super comfortable, but what made it weird was that it faced this massive picture window that looked out toward the front yard. During the day, it gave a nice view of the property. At night, though, it was just a huge black rectangle that made me feel exposed, like someone could be watching from outside and I wouldn't know it. About 4 days into my visit, I woke up in the middle of the night to this horrible smell. It's hard to describe exactly, but imagine if a skunk sprayed directly into a pile of rotting meat, then throw in some weird musky odor. It was so strong it actually woke me up from a dead sleep. I remember sitting up and gagging a little. My cousin was awake too. He'd come out to grab water from the kitchen and was standing there with this disgusted look on his face. "You smell that?" he whispered. "Yeah. What the hell is it?" I said. He shrugged, and we both went to the kitchen where his mum was already up, making herself tea. She didn't seem nearly as bothered by the smell as we were. When we asked her about it, she just casually said, "Oh, that's probably just the skunk ape. He's been hanging around the property this summer." The way she said it was so matter-of-fact, like she was telling us about a raccoon that kept getting into the trash. My cousin and I looked at each other, not sure if she was messing with us. I'd never heard of a skunk ape before. She didn't elaborate, just finished making her tea and went back to bed, telling us not to worry about it. The next day, I asked my cousin what his mom had been talking about. He seemed kind of embarrassed, but explained that there had been rumors around the neighborhood about some kind of creature in the area. I thought he was just trying to scare me, which would have been typical for him. But later that same day, we were hanging out with some of the neighborhood kids, and they all had stories about this thing. One kid said his dad had seen it near the tree line at dusk, standing upright like a man but much bigger. Another kid claimed it had been spotted crossing the canal that ran behind several properties. Someone else mentioned that a local rancher had found strange tracks near his livestock pens. I still wasn't completely buying it. I figured it was just local folklore, like how every small town has some kind of monster legend. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me a little nervous about sleeping in that front room with the big window. A couple nights later, I couldn't sleep. It was maybe around 1 in the morning, and I was just lying there on that fold-out couch, staring at the ceiling. My cousin had crashed on the floor nearby because we'd been up late watching movies. The house was completely silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. That's when I smelled it again. That same horrible stink from before, but stronger this time. It seemed to be coming from outside. I sat up slowly, my heart already beating faster. I was about to wake my cousin when something moved across the picture window. It wasn't like a person walking by. It was a massive shadow that blocked out the moonlight completely. Whatever it was huge, way taller than an adult man. I froze, not even breathing. The shadow paused right in front of the window. Then it leaned forward like it was peering inside. I could make out the silhouette of what looked like a head with a sloped forehead and broad shoulders. It seemed to be looking at its own reflection in the glass. I reached down and shook my cousin awake, keeping my eyes fixed on the window. He started to say something, but I clamped my hand over his mouth and pointed. He went completely still when he saw it. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. The creature opened its mouth and let out a scream that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It wasn't like a big cat or a bear. It was deeper, more guttural, but also had this almost human quality that made it 1,000 times worse. I could literally feel the sound vibrating in my chest cavity. It was so loud that the window actually seemed to vibrate. My cousin's parents came running into the room. By then, the creature had started moving along the side of the house. Without saying a word, we all moved through the house, following it from window to window. Nobody turned on any lights. I think we were all afraid of scaring it off, as terrified as we were. We ended up in my cousin's room, which had a view of the backyard. The creature had moved to the edge of the property where these wild watermelons grew. It squatted down on its haunches and began tearing into them. I'll never forget watching it eat. It was using both hands, bringing food to its mouth in a way that was disturbingly human-like. But everything else about it was just wrong. In the moonlight, I could see that it was covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, but longer, matted hair that hung in patches. The hair was a reddish-brown color where the moonlight hit it. Its face and palms seemed to have less hair, and its skin looked dark and leathery. It was hard to judge its size exactly, but it had to be at least 7 feet tall, with massive shoulders and long arms. After it finished eating, it walked over to the small lake behind their property. It moved in a strange way, not fully upright like a person, but not on all fours either, kind of a hunched, swinging gait. At the water's edge, it crouched down and began to drink, cupping water in its hands. Then, as if it sensed us watching, it suddenly stood up straight, turned its head toward the house, and stared for what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds. Then it simply turned and walked into the trees, disappearing from sight. Nobody in the house spoke for a long time. Finally, my cousin's dad just said, "Well, I guess your mother was right," and went back to bed. But none of us slept the rest of that night. The next few days were tense. News started spreading around the neighborhood about strange things happening. The neighbor who owned horses found one of them outside its fence one morning, trembling and covered in sweat. When he checked it over, he found what looked like large hand-shaped bruises on its hindquarters, as if something had grabbed it. Even more disturbing was what happened at a nearby cattle farm. A bull, not a calf, but a full-grown bull, was found dead in its pen. Its head had been completely torn off and thrown across the pasture. The rancher insisted it couldn't have been done by any normal predator. The force required to decapitate a bull like that was just beyond anything native to Florida. The most terrifying incident happened about 5 days after we saw it at the house. My cousin's older sister and her husband were visiting for dinner. They arrived late and really shaken up. They said they'd been driving on one of the back roads when they came across a sheriff's deputy's patrol car, stopped in the middle of the road, its lights flashing. According to them, the deputy had hit something with his car, something that had walked out from the swamp on 2 legs. But instead of being killed, the creature had stood back up after being struck. The deputy was still in his car, frantically calling for backup, when the thing walked up to the driver's side window and looked in at him. My cousin's sister said she and her husband watched in horror as the creature screamed at the deputy. The same ear-splitting scream we'd heard, and then slammed both fists down on the trunk of the patrol car with enough force to lift the back end off the ground. After that, it limped back into the swamp, leaving the deputy completely freaked out. Within hours, there were police cars, wildlife officers, and even some guys in plain clothes who people said were from some government agency all over the area. They brought in dogs, mounted officers, and even helicopters with spotlights. They found footprints, massive ones that were similar to human feet, but much larger and with different proportions, leading into the swamp. But the tracks ended where the water got deep, and despite searching for days, they never found anything else. I never saw the skunk ape again after that night at the window. My parents picked me up a few days later, cutting my visit short after hearing about all the commotion in the area. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The face at the window, that horrible smell, the way it moved and ate, that scream that seemed to go right through me. Years later, I still catch myself scanning the tree line at dusk sometimes, or waking up in a cold sweat thinking I've smelled that distinctive odor again. I've read about Florida's skunk ape legends since then, but most of the accounts sound like typical Bigfoot stories. What we experienced was different. It wasn't just some blurry figure glimpsed at a distance, or strange noises in the woods. It was right there, looking in our window, only inches of glass separating us. And whatever it was intelligent enough to recognize itself in a reflection, strong enough to tear the head off a bull, and bold enough to attack a police car. I don't talk about it much because people either think I'm making it up or they try to explain it away as a bear or some other known animal. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm back in Florida visiting family and I drive through those rural areas at night, I find myself watching the shadows along the road a little more carefully than I probably should. Story 6. I never thought I'd be the guy posting one of these stories, but I need to share what happened to me. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life, hunting, fishing, camping, since I was old enough to walk. I know what's out there in the woods, or at least I thought I did until mid-September last year. I'd taken a week off work to go solo camping in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I've been going up there for years, but this time I wanted to try a spot I'd never been to before. I found this perfect location about 1.5 miles from the main road, far enough that you wouldn't get any random people wandering through, but not so remote that I'd be screwed if something went wrong. The first day was completely normal. I hiked in around noon, set up my tent, built a fire pit, and strung up my food cache between 2 trees about 100 feet from my campsite. Standard procedure to keep bears away. I cooked some freeze-dried beef stew for dinner, had a couple beers, and turned in early. First night went without a hitch, just the usual forest sounds, nothing weird. The next day I spent the morning fishing at a small stream about 1/4 mile from my camp. Caught 3 decent-sized brook trout, cleaned them on site, and headed back to camp around 3 in the afternoon. I was planning to cook the fish for dinner, so I started gathering kindling for the fire. That's when I first noticed something was off. I was sitting near my fire pit, sorting through the wood I'd collected, when I realized the woods had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, I mean dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. If you spend time in the woods, you know how unnatural that feels. It's like the air itself gets thicker somehow. Still, I've experienced predator silence before. Sometimes when a bear or mountain lion is moving through an area, everything else shuts up. So I wasn't particularly scared, just aware. I remember checking that my hunting knife was on my belt and glancing at my pack where I keep bear spray, just being cautious. About 20 minutes later, I heard it, something heavy moving through the underbrush behind my tent. And I don't mean squirrel heavy or raccoon heavy. This was big. The footsteps had weight to them, cracking branches and pressing into the forest floor in a way that made my chest tighten. Whatever it was big enough to make noise, even though it seemed to be trying to move quietly. I stood up slowly and turned toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe another hiker had wandered into the area, though I'd have been surprised. The movement immediately stopped. That's what got me. The instant, complete stillness. Like whatever it was had frozen in place, listening, watching. I walked around my tent to where I'd heard the sounds, looking for tracks or broken vegetation, but didn't see anything obvious. The ground was pretty dry and covered with pine needles, so it wasn't ideal for tracking anyway. I spent about 10 minutes poking around, but eventually gave up and went back to preparing dinner. As dusk approached, I needed more firewood for the evening. The temperature drops fast up there in September. I grabbed my hatchet and headed about 50 yards west of my camp, where I'd seen some good deadfall earlier. I was focused on collecting wood when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're being watched. It was overwhelming. I straightened up slowly and turned around, scanning the trees. That's when I saw them. At first, I only saw the big one, an adult standing partially behind a massive white pine about 30 yards away. I froze completely, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 7.5 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders that must have been twice the width of mine. It was covered in dark brown hair, not shaggy like you see in those fake videos, but more like a short, dense coat. Its face was mostly hidden by the tree, but I could see one dark eye watching me intently. As I stood there, unable to move, I realized there was more movement nearby. Two smaller creatures, I'd guess about 4 feet tall, were moving around about 10 yards from the adult. They were clearly juveniles, with the same general appearance but lighter colored hair, almost cinnamon colored. Their movements were different from the adult, more energetic, less cautious. They were crouching down, picking things up off the ground, examining them, foraging, I realized. They were looking for food. One of the young ones would find something, examine it, then sometimes carry it over to show the other. They weren't making any vocalizations I could hear, but their body language reminded me of kids playing while a parent watches. All the while, the adult stood completely still, alternating between watching the juveniles and scanning the surroundings. It would occasionally turn its head to check different directions, moving with this eerie smoothness that didn't match its massive size. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. It could have been 2 minutes or 10. Time felt suspended. I didn't feel afraid exactly, more like I was in a state of complete awe. I was seeing something that most people don't believe exists, and they were just living their lives. The adult was protecting the young ones, teaching them to find food. It was so fundamentally normal yet completely extraordinary at the same time. Then one of the juveniles suddenly stopped what it was doing and looked directly at me. It must have caught my scent or heard me breathing. It made a quick movement, turning toward the adult and raising one arm. The adult immediately locked eyes with me. I could feel it even at that distance, and made this low grunting sound, not aggressive, just authoritative. All three of them began moving away. They didn't run or panic. They just moved deliberately through the trees, the adult positioning itself between me and the juveniles. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the thick forest. Their ability to vanish was astonishing. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, with barely a sound despite their size. I stood there for several more minutes, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to follow them, but I knew that would be both disrespectful and potentially dangerous. I wasn't afraid they would hurt me. If they'd wanted to do that, they'd had plenty of opportunity. But I felt like I'd been allowed to witness something private, something not meant for human eyes. I gathered the firewood I'd dropped and made my way back to camp in a daze. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see them watching me, but the forest had returned to normal. Birds were calling again, and I could hear squirrels chattering in the trees. I debated whether to pack up and leave right then, but it was getting dark, and honestly, I didn't feel threatened. I built up my fire bigger than usual that night, I'll admit, not out of fear, but because I wanted to create a clear boundary. This was my space, and I wasn't encroaching further on theirs. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to memorize every detail, but the woods around me remained quiet. No heavy footsteps, no strange sounds, just the normal nighttime forest. At first light, I made coffee and decided to investigate the area where I'd seen the family. I found exactly what I was hoping for, evidence I wasn't losing my mind. Near the big white pine, there were several large impressions in the dirt. Footprints nearly twice the size of my own boot. They weren't perfect prints, just depressions in the forest floor, but they were unmistakably foot-shaped with 5 distinct toes. I also noticed several broken branches on the smaller trees around the area, snapped off cleanly about 7 feet up, too high for a bear to reach standing on its hind legs. And in one spot, I found what looked like a small pile of berries that had been collected and then dropped when they fled. I didn't take photos or make casts of the prints. I didn't have the materials, and honestly, it didn't even occur to me at the time. I was still processing what I'd witnessed. Instead, I packed up my camp and hiked out that morning. Not because I was scared, but because I felt like I'd seen what I was meant to see. My presence was disturbing their home, and it seemed right to leave them in peace. The encounter changed something in me. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors, and I'd always considered myself knowledgeable about wildlife. But seeing those creatures, that family, made me realize how little we actually know about what's out there, the way they moved, the clear intelligence in their actions, the family structure. These weren't mindless animals. They were something else entirely. What stays with me most is how the adult protected the young ones without showing aggression toward me. It just moved them away from potential danger, and the way the juveniles were learning, examining things, showing each other what they'd found. It was too deliberate, too complex to dismiss. I haven't told many people about what I saw. Who would believe me? But I know what I witnessed, and I'm certain they're out there, moving silently through the forests, raising their families, and staying hidden from a world that would never understand or accept them. I consider myself incredibly lucky to have been allowed that brief glimpse into their world. Story 7. I've never been able to forget what happened that summer day in Valentine back in 1957. I was 6 years old, but the memory is still as clear as if it happened yesterday. I'm 73 now, and I've told this story to very few people over the years because most folks just don't believe me. They think it's just the imagination of a little girl running wild, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I've carried it with me my whole life. It was late August, one of those perfect Nebraska afternoons when the heat of summer was just starting to give way to the first hints of fall. The sky was that deep kind of blue you only get in the Midwest, not a cloud to be seen. A bunch of us neighborhood kids were playing hide and seek, something we did almost every day when the weather was nice. There were probably 8 or 9 of us in total, ranging from about 5 to 10 years old. My best friend at the time was Mary Beth. We were inseparable that summer, both of us with pigtails and skinned knees, both missing our front teeth. That day we were wearing matching red canvas shoes my mom had found on sale at Woolworth's. I remember this because later I'd be staring at those shoes as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Mary Beth and I had decided to be sneaky and go off by ourselves to find a really good hiding spot while Tommy was counting to 100 with his eyes covered against the big oak tree in the Petersons' front yard. We slipped away from the other kids, giggling and shushing each other as we headed down the alley that ran behind the houses on Elm Street. This alley wasn't paved, it was just hard-packed dirt with weeds growing up along the sides where people's back fences and garages lined it. It wasn't a scary place during the day. We used it all the time as a shortcut. Mrs. Wilson used to hang her laundry on a line that stretched from her back porch to a tall post near the alley, and I remember the sheets were flapping in the breeze as we passed by. "Let's hide in the Andersons' shed," Mary Beth whispered, pointing further down the alley. "Tommy never looks there." I nodded, and we kept walking. We were maybe halfway down the alley when I noticed something at the far end, where the alley opened up to Cherry Street. At first, I thought it was someone's dad coming home early from work, but within seconds, I realized whatever was walking toward us wasn't anybody's dad. It wasn't anybody I'd ever seen before. I stopped so suddenly that Mary Beth bumped into me from behind. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't speak. I just pointed. The figure at the end of the alley was huge, taller than any grown-up I'd ever seen. Mr. Peterson had been the tallest man in Valentine at 6'4", but this thing was way taller. It was walking upright on two legs, just like a person, but there was nothing person-like about it otherwise. It was covered head to toe in dark, thick hair, not like fur on a dog, but longer, shaggier, almost like the pictures I'd seen of buffalo, but darker. The hair moved slightly as it walked, swaying with each step. Its arms were the most unnatural thing about it. They hung down much lower than they should have, almost to its knees. Even from that distance, I could tell the hands were massive. The way it moved was so strange, deliberate and steady, but somehow not right. Each step seemed too controlled, too careful, like it was thinking about how to walk, and it was coming straight toward us, moving at a steady pace. I remember feeling like my feet had grown roots into the dirt of the alley. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I just stood there, gripping Mary Beth's hand so tight, my knuckles were white. That's when it made the sound. I've spent my whole life trying to find the right words to describe that sound, but nothing quite captures it. It was like a roar, but mixed with a scream. Not like any animal I'd ever heard at the zoo or on TV. It was loud enough that it seemed to vibrate in my chest, and it echoed slightly off the houses and fences around us. It wasn't a quick sound either. It stretched out for several seconds, rising and falling in pitch. After it made that noise, it seemed to pick up its pace, moving more deliberately toward us. That's when the spell broke and my body finally remembered how to move. "Run!" I screamed to Mary Beth, and we both turned at the same moment and ran like our lives depended on it. I didn't look back, not even once. I was too scared to. I just ran, staring down at those red canvas shoes slapping against the dirt, feeling Mary Beth's hand still clutched in mine. We burst out of the alley and onto Elm Street, not stopping until we reached Tommy, who was still counting against the tree. 87, 88. His eyes were still covered. I grabbed his arm, making him jump. "Tommy, stop! There's something in the alley." He uncovered his eyes, annoyed at first until he saw our faces. I must have looked terrified because his expression quickly changed to concern. "What's wrong? What did you see?" I tried to explain, but I was crying and out of breath. Mary Beth was too. The other kids gathered around us, asking questions all at once. When I finally managed to tell them about the tall, hairy thing in the alley, the older boys laughed. "It was probably just Old Man Jenkins in his hunting coat," said Billy Roberts, who was 10 and thought he knew everything. "No exclamation mark," I insisted. "It wasn't a person. It was huge and covered in hair, and it made a terrible noise." "She's right," Mary Beth said quietly beside me. I saw it too, but the others weren't convinced. Some of them even wanted to go look, but I begged them not to. Eventually, Tommy's mom called us all in for Kool-Aid and cookies, and the game was forgotten. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen. That night at dinner, I tried to tell my parents. My dad patted my head and said I had quite an imagination, while my mom suggested maybe we shouldn't read so many comic books before bed. They exchanged that grown-up look over my head, the one that said they thought I was just making things up. The next day at the breakfast table, my mom was talking to Mrs. Peterson on the phone. I was picking at my Cheerios when I heard her say, "The strangest thing. Miss Clark down on Elm Street said she heard some kind of animal sound yesterday afternoon. Said it like to scared her half to death." My spoon clattered into my bowl. Miss Clark was my second grade teacher. She lived in the blue house at the corner of Elm and Cherry, right where the alley came out. After my mum hung up, I told her that Miss Clark had heard the thing that Mary Beth and I saw. For a moment, I thought maybe she believed me, but then she just smiled sadly and said, "Honey, it was probably just a stray dog or maybe a coyote that wandered into town. Nothing to worry about." But I knew better. Dogs don't walk on two legs. Dogs don't have arms that hang down to their knees. Dogs don't make sounds that make your whole body freeze with fear. A few days later, I worked up the courage to visit Miss Clark after school. She was in her front yard, tending to her rose bushes when I approached her picket fence. "Miss Clark?" I called softly. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Well, hello there, Ellie. What brings you by?" I shuffled my feet nervously before blurting out, "Did you really hear something strange the other day? Something that made a scary noise?" Her smile faded slightly, and she set down her gardening shears. As a matter of fact, I did. It was the oddest thing. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when I heard it, like nothing I've ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite, well, I don't know what. It gave me goosebumps. "I saw it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Me and Mary Beth. In the alley. It was tall and hairy and walking like a person. I expected her to laugh or tell me I was being silly, but she didn't. Instead, she came over to the fence and looked at me very seriously." "What time was this, Ellie?" "Around 3 o'clock, I think. We were playing hide and seek." She nodded slowly. "That's about when I heard it too." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you tell your parents?" "They don't believe me. They think I made it up." She reached over the fence and patted my hand. "Well, I believe that you saw something, Ellie. Sometimes there are things in this world that are hard to explain." That was the first time an adult had taken me seriously, and it meant everything to me. Miss Clark never talked about it again, and neither did I, at least not with the other kids or my parents. But Mary Beth and I would whisper about it sometimes when we were alone, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I didn't know what a Sasquatch or Bigfoot was back then. Those names weren't common in 1957, especially not in a small town like Valentine. It wasn't until years later, when I was in high school and saw a newspaper article about sightings in the Pacific Northwest, that I realized there might be a name for what we'd encountered. Over the years, I've read everything I could find about similar sightings. Some match what we saw perfectly: the height, the long arms, the vocalizations. I've talked to Mary Beth about it a few times as adults, and her memory matches mine in every detail. Whatever we saw that day, we both saw the same thing. I've never gone back down that alley. My family moved away from Valentine when I was 10, and I've only been back to visit a handful of times. The town has changed. The alley is paved now, and many of the old houses have been replaced. Miss Clark passed away years ago. Most of the kids we played with that day have moved away or lost touch. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep at night, I can still hear that sound, that raw scream that seemed to come from something that shouldn't exist. I can still see those long arms swinging slightly as it walked toward us with purpose, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run away when we did. I don't know what it was. I don't know where it came from or where it went. All I know is what I saw that day in 1957 was real. It wasn't a man in a costume. It wasn't my imagination. It was something other. Something that shouldn't have been in that alley in Valentine, Nebraska. And sometimes I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, walking those same deliberate steps, making that same bone-chilling sound, waiting for someone else to see it and not be believed. Story 8. I've spent 14 years in active duty with the Marines and another 8 in law enforcement. I've been in combat zones. I've faced armed suspects. I've been shot at. None of that prepared me for what happened last November while hunting in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I'm not easily spooked. My buddies will tell you I'm usually the level-headed one, which is why I haven't shared this story widely. I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. It was the second day of deer season. Our hunting party consisted of my father, my 2 brothers-in-law, and me. We'd split up at dawn, each taking different sections of this remote valley we've hunted for years. The valley is surrounded by steep hills, and that morning they were covered in about 4 inches of fresh snow. The temperature was hovering around 28 degrees. I'd hiked about 2 miles from our camp to a spot I'd scouted earlier in the year, a natural funnel where deer would likely pass through when pushed from feeding areas. By 9 in the morning, I had my small portable stand set up against a large oak tree with good sight lines in 3 directions. The 4th direction faced uphill into dense forest. The morning passed uneventfully. I saw a few does, but was holding out for a buck. Around 1 in the afternoon, I had just finished eating a sandwich when I heard it. At first, it was so distant I almost didn't register it. A vocalization that's hard to describe, not quite a growl, not a howl. The closest I can come to describing it is a deep, rhythmic belching sound that seemed to resonate through the valley. It was low-pitched and powerful enough that I could almost feel it more than hear it. My first thought was that it might be another hunter using some kind of call I wasn't familiar with. But this sound, it wasn't like any game call I'd ever heard, and it was continuous, not the short bursts you'd use to attract deer. For about 20 minutes I just listened as this sound gradually got closer. It would stop for a few minutes, then start again, each time noticeably nearer. Whatever was making it was heading directly toward my position from the north end of the valley. By 1:30, I estimated the source was maybe half a mile away. That's when the hair on the back of my neck started standing up. There was something deliberate about how this sound was moving. It wasn't the random path of an animal foraging. It was coming straight for me. I've heard pretty much every animal in these Pennsylvania woods. Bears, coyotes, bobcats. I know their sounds. This wasn't any of them. It wasn't human either. By 2 o'clock, I made the decision to pack up, even though I still had at least 3 hours of good hunting light left. Something felt wrong, and years in combat zones taught me to trust that feeling. I quietly took down my small stand and packed it away, then gathered my backpack and rifle. Just as I shouldered my pack, the vocalization stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound. The woods were completely still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That's when I heard the first crack. It came from the ridgeline directly in front of me. Maybe 100 yards up the steep hill, a loud, sharp snap of breaking wood. Not the small twigs that break when deer move through brush. This was the sound of substantial branches being broken with force. I immediately raised my rifle, looking through the scope toward the tree line at the top of the ridge. The forest was thick up there, mostly hemlocks and white pines with heavy undergrowth. I couldn't see anything moving, but I could hear it. Whatever was up there was big, and it was moving back and forth along the ridgeline, just inside the tree line. Every few seconds there would be another loud crack. Sometimes it sounded like branches breaking, other times like something heavy hitting a tree trunk. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 10 minutes, I stood absolutely still, rifle aimed at the ridge, listening to this thing move back and forth. I knew from the pattern of sounds that it was pacing about a 50-yard section, never coming out into the open, but never moving away either. I'm 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. I've hunted these woods since I was a kid. I've encountered black bears, including a sow with cubs, and never felt the kind of fear I felt in those moments. My mouth went dry. My hands, despite the cold, were sweating inside my gloves. The feeling that washed over me wasn't just fear. It was a primal understanding that I was being watched by something that could harm me if it wanted to. The strangest part was that whatever was up there seemed to be intentionally letting me know it was there. The way it was breaking branches. It wasn't the natural sound of something moving through the forest. It was deliberate, like it was sending a message. After those long minutes, the sounds began moving to my right, following the ridgeline. I kept my rifle trained in that direction as the cracking slowly circled around until it was almost behind me. The thing had moved about a quarter mile in just a couple of minutes, which meant it was covering ground incredibly fast through dense forest on a steep hillside. That's when I decided to get the hell out of there. I started backing down the hill, keeping my eyes on the tree line and my rifle ready. I moved as quietly as I could, but with each step I took, there would be an answering crack from the ridge, as if the thing was paralleling my movement. This continued for about 30 minutes as I made my way back toward where I knew my father was hunting. About a mile away in a meadow to the south, the sounds followed me the entire time, always staying up on the ridge, always just out of sight. When I was about 200 yards from the meadow, the cracking sound stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. The forest was still eerily quiet, but the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted somewhat. I found my dad right where he was supposed to be, sitting against a tree at the edge of the meadow. When he saw me approaching in the middle of prime hunting hours, rifle at the ready instead of slung over my shoulder, he immediately knew something was wrong. "You okay, Jim?" he asked, standing up. I wasn't sure what to say. How do you tell your old man, who's been hunting these woods for 50 years, that you got spooked by a noise? "Did you hear anything strange today?" I asked instead. He shrugged. "Heard some weird bellowing sound a couple hours ago. Thought it might be elk, but they're not supposed to be in this area." "That's what I heard," I said. But then, whatever it was, started breaking trees up on the ridge. Big branches, Dad, and it was following me. To his credit, my father didn't laugh or dismiss me. He knows I'm not the type to imagine things. "Probably a bear," he said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. When we met up with my brothers-in-law at camp that evening and I told the whole story, they weren't as understanding. They joked about me seeing Bigfoot and made Sasquatch calls the rest of the night. I didn't blame them. I would have done the same if one of them had told the story. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Whatever was on that ridge wasn't a bear. Bears don't pace back and forth like that. They don't follow you for half a mile, staying just out of sight. And they definitely don't make that deep, resonating sound I heard. The thing that bothers me most is the feeling I had, the absolute certainty that I was being watched and evaluated. It felt like the thing was demonstrating that it was in control. It could have come down that hill at any time, but it chose to stay just out of sight, letting me know it was there and that it was following me. We stayed 3 more days at that camp, but I never went back to that section of the valley. I hunted the meadows with my dad instead. We never heard the sound again, and I never told anyone outside our hunting party about what happened. I've spent months trying to rationalize what I experienced. I've researched animal sounds, watched videos of bears breaking trees, looked into other wildlife that might be in those Pennsylvania forests. Nothing matches. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't tired or stressed. I'm a trained observer with years of experience in the woods, and what I observed that day was something I can't explain, something powerful enough to snap thick branches with ease, move through dense forest faster than any human could, and make a vocalization unlike anything I've ever heard. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or any other cryptid. I honestly don't know what it was. But I know it was real. I know it was intelligent, and I know it wanted me to leave its territory. I'll be going back to Clearfield County this coming deer season. Part of me hopes I never hear that sound again, but another part of me wants answers. I just don't know if I'm ready for what those answers might be. Story 9. I've been trying to make sense of what happened that night for years now. May 27th, 2016. That date is burned into my brain forever. I'm David Wilson, and my wife Emma and I live in western New Jersey, in a house that sits right up against a dense forest. We always loved that about our property. The privacy, the wildlife, being surrounded by nature. That was before. It was around 3 in the morning when it started. I'm usually a deep sleeper, but something jerked me awake like an electric shock. These screams were coming through our open bedroom windows. Not human screams, but not any animal I recognized either. I've lived near woods most of my life. I know what foxes, coyotes, bobcats, and even bears sound like. This wasn't that. I remember sitting bolt upright, heart pounding, trying to place what could possibly make that sound. It was like a cross between a woman screaming and something else, something primal. The pitch would fluctuate in this unnatural way that sent chills down my spine. Emma was still asleep, so I nudged her. "Em, wake up," I whispered, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. "Do you hear that?" She woke up confused at first, then her eyes widened when the sound came again. "What the hell is that?" she asked, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm going to check it out." She gave me this look, half fear, half, "Are you crazy?" but nodded. I told her to stay put while I investigated. As I got out of bed, the screams stopped, which somehow felt worse than when they were happening. I walked down the hallway toward our kitchen, where we have this big sliding glass door that leads out to our elevated deck. The whole house was dead quiet. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I was about halfway there when Emma called out from the bedroom, "David, there's something outside our window." My blood turned to ice. I rushed back to ask what she'd heard, and she described this weird knocking sound. 3 distinct hollow knocks, like someone tapping on the side of the house with something hard. Not random, but deliberate. "Check on Rex," I told her, referring to our German shepherd. "We keep him in his kennel at night in the spare room." She went to check while I continued toward the kitchen. When I got to the slider, I couldn't see anything through the glass except the darkness of our backyard. The security light wasn't on, which meant nothing had triggered the motion sensor yet. Emma came back and confirmed Rex was fine, just alert and whining softly in his kennel. I reached for the switch that controls our exterior lights and flipped them all on at once. The yard lit up, but I still couldn't see anything unusual. Just our deck, the yard, and the tree line about 50 feet away. "I'm going to open the door," I told Emma, who stood a few feet behind me. The moment, and I mean the exact second, I slid that door open, all hell broke loose in the trees. There was this explosive sound of movement, like something massive was thrashing through the undergrowth, not just in one spot, but in multiple places simultaneously. I'm talking about serious movement. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the sounds of heavy bodies pushing through vegetation. The craziest part? I could see the trees themselves shaking, not just small saplings, but mature trees swaying and vibrating like something big was slamming into them. And this was happening in 3, maybe 5 different spots all at once, spread across maybe 100 feet of tree line. I've been hunting my whole life. I know what deer sound like moving through brush. I know what bears sound like. This was different, way different. It was too powerful, too coordinated, and there was no vocalization, no snorting, no grunting, no howling, just this overwhelming physical presence making its way through the forest. I felt this primal fear wash over me, like my body knew something my mind hadn't processed yet. I closed the slider and told Emma to stay put. "I'm getting my shotgun," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I went to our gun safe, unlocked it with shaking hands, and pulled out my Remington 870, loaded it with 4 shells of buckshot. The whole time, we could still hear the movement outside, getting closer, not farther away. When I came back to the kitchen, Emma was standing by the slider, peering out into the yard. "They're still out there," she whispered. "I can see the bushes moving." I joined her at the glass. She was right. Now the activity had moved from the tree line to the edge of our yard. Whatever these things were, they were coming closer. I took a deep breath. "I'm going out on the deck." "David, no," Emma pleaded. "I need to see what we're dealing with," I insisted. "Lock the door behind me. I'll knock 3 times when I want back in." I stepped out onto our deck, shotgun held ready but pointed downward. The wooden boards creaked under my feet. The night air felt unnaturally still and heavy. From the elevated position of the deck, I had a better view of the yard. The security lights cast these harsh shadows everywhere, creating pockets of complete darkness. The movement in the vegetation continued, but now it was more measured, like whatever was out there knew I was watching. I realized suddenly that having all the exterior lights on was actually working against me. I was fully illuminated on the deck, while whatever was out there could hide in the shadows. I started moving toward the light switch mounted on the exterior wall when Emma tapped urgently on the glass. Her face was pale with terror as she pointed toward the side of the house. I couldn't see what she was seeing from my angle, but her expression told me everything I needed to know. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, not the careful steps of a deer or even the shambling gait of a bear. These were bipedal footsteps running toward the deck from the side of the house. I spun in that direction, raising my shotgun, but saw nothing yet. Emma yanked the slider open and screamed, "Get inside now!" I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes fixed on the corner of the deck where the footsteps were headed. Emma grabbed my shirt and practically dragged me inside, slamming the door shut. Just as the door closed, there were 3 deep guttural grunts from right beside the deck, maybe 10 feet from where we stood. These weren't animal sounds I recognized. They were deep, rumbling, almost purposeful, like something trying to communicate. I pushed Emma behind me and raised my shotgun again, pointing it through the glass. My hands were slick with sweat. "Open the door," I said. "No fucking way," Emma responded. "Open it. I need to see what's out there." She reluctantly slid the door open again, and I stepped halfway out, shotgun raised and ready. The grunts came again, deeper and more aggressive this time, from just below the deck. So close I could almost feel the vibration of them in my chest. Fear won out. I backed into the house and we locked the door. We stood there, frozen, hearts hammering in our chests as heavy footsteps moved away from the house. Again, not in just one direction, but in multiple directions simultaneously, like 3 to 5 large creatures departing into the forest at once. We stayed up the rest of the night, lights on, shotgun ready. Rex whined in his kennel, but we were too scared to let him out. What if he chased after whatever was out there? The house felt impossibly small and vulnerable, the darkness outside pressing in against every window. When the first light of dawn finally came, the forest was quiet again. After checking every window and door, I finally worked up the courage to go outside, shotgun still in hand. The physical evidence was there. The bushes at the base of our deck were flattened, like something very heavy had pushed them down. Along the tree line, fresh breaks in branches showed where something tall had moved through. The breaks were high up, 7, maybe 8 feet off the ground. Way too high for a deer or bear. I looked for tracks, but our yard has hard-packed soil that doesn't take impressions easily. There were some disturbed areas, but nothing clear enough to identify. Emma and I spent that day researching, trying to make sense of what happened. We looked up every animal native to New Jersey. Nothing matched what we experienced. The strength, the speed, the boldness around humans and artificial light, the coordinated movement, those distinctive vocalizations. Nothing in our known wildlife catalogue fit. That's when we stumbled onto forums about Bigfoot encounters. Reading other people's experiences was like looking into a mirror of our own. The knocking sounds, the tree shaking, the coordinated group movement, the deep guttural vocalizations, the sense of intelligence behind the encounter. I was a skeptic before that night, thought Bigfoot was just a myth, a story people told around campfires. Now, I don't know what to think. All I know is what we experienced was real, it was terrifying, and it changed us. We still live in the same house. We didn't have the financial freedom to just up and move, but our relationship with the surrounding forest has fundamentally changed. We keep our windows closed at night now, no matter how nice the weather. The blinds stay drawn after dark. Rex sleeps in our bedroom, and my shotgun stays loaded. Sometimes on quiet nights I hear those knocks again, distant but distinct. 3 hollow knocks, like someone sending a message. I never answer, never investigate. Some doors are better left closed. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me, but it happened. May 27th, 2016. The night the forest came for us. Story 10. I never thought I'd be writing something like this. I've always been the skeptical type, the person who needs evidence before believing in anything. But what happened to me on July 26th, 2018 has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I'm a wildlife researcher specializing in habitat conservation in the upper Midwest. I've spent countless hours in remote forests, tracking animals, cataloging species, and documenting ecosystem changes. Nothing in my scientific training prepared me for what I saw that day in the Checkamigga-Nicolet National Forest. It started when I connected with some members of the local Ojibwe community for a research project. After working together for a few weeks, we developed a good rapport. One evening around the campfire, they started sharing stories that had been passed down through generations about strange encounters in certain parts of the forest. I listened politely, but honestly, I dismissed most of it as folklore. Then one of them, a man named Michael, who I'd come to respect for his incredible knowledge of the forest, mentioned a bizarre structure they'd found deep in the woods, a massive X-shaped formation made of limbs that couldn't have been created by natural means. I was intrigued enough from a scientific perspective to agree to join them on an expedition to document the structure. Our group consisted of 5 people: Michael and his cousin Tom from the Ojibwe community, my research colleague Jen, a local guide named Keith, and myself. The day of the hike was unusually still. We headed out early, around 7 in the morning. The forest was thick with summer foliage, and as we ventured deeper, the usual woodland sounds seemed to diminish. I remember thinking how strange it was that the birds weren't as vocal as they typically are at that time of day. The only consistent sounds were our footsteps and the occasional distant call of frogs from the scattered bogs we passed. The terrain was challenging, dense underbrush, fallen trees, and sudden changes in elevation as we navigated between hills and river drainages. The humidity was oppressive, making my clothes stick to my skin. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead constantly and drinking more water than usual. About 15 minutes into our hike, we reached a point where the trail forked. Tom suggested he and Keith cut directly through a particularly dense section of brush to save time, while Michael, Jen, and I would continue on the slightly longer path that followed higher ground. We agreed to meet at the strange structure within the hour. As we continued climbing the gradual slope, Michael suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, turning his head toward a thick patch of vegetation to our right. I paused and listened. Nothing but the faint sound of insects buzzing. "What did you hear?" I asked. "Movement. Something big moving through the trees," he replied, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. I've spent enough time in these forests to know what deer, bear, and moose sound like when they move through the underbrush. Each has a distinctive pattern. Deer are light and quick, bears are heavy and deliberate, moose are surprisingly quiet for their size, but still create distinct breaks in branches. What Michael described, and what we heard next, didn't match any of these. There was a soft, swishing sound, followed by what I can only describe as methodical movement. Careful, deliberate placement of weight. It wasn't random or panicked like an animal fleeing would sound. It felt intentional. We continued walking, but I could feel the tension between us. Jen hadn't heard anything and seemed confused by our sudden alertness. The trail opened up slightly into an area where the trees were more spaced out, though still tall and mature. The underbrush was less dense here, offering better visibility between trunks for maybe 30 to 40 feet before the vegetation thickened again. I was scanning the area as we walked, more out of scientific habit than fear, when something caught my eye to the right. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. About 20 yards away, partially obscured by a tree trunk, I saw what looked like a large, hair-covered arm moving from a straight position into a bend at the elbow. The movement was so human-like that for a split second, I thought it might be another hiker wearing some kind of furry jacket. But that made no sense given the summer heat. The arm was thick, muscular, and covered in light brown hair that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. It wasn't a bear's limb. I've studied bears extensively, and this was unmistakably different in proportion and movement. It bent exactly like a human elbow, but it was massive. Before I could even gasp, Michael grabbed my arm tightly. His face had gone pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered urgently. I nodded, unable to form words. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I saw its upper body," Michael continued, his voice barely audible. "Wide shoulders, tall, really tall, same light brown hair. What struck me was that we had both witnessed the same movement from slightly different angles. I had seen the arm, while Michael had caught a glimpse of the upper torso. The creature had quickly ducked behind cover when it realized we had spotted it. My scientific training kicked in, and I immediately pulled out my camera to photograph the location. Through the viewfinder, I could see a narrow sapling where the creature had been standing. It was the only reference point I had to gauge the height of what we'd seen. Jen was confused, having missed the sighting entirely. "What are you two talking about?" she asked, looking between us with concern. I couldn't find the words to explain. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Was it a bear standing unusually? No. The proportions and movement were all wrong. A person in some kind of suit, in this remote location, in sweltering heat, moving with that kind of agility, it seemed absurd. We stood frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if everything was holding its breath. "We should keep moving," Michael finally said, his voice tense. "Staying in one place isn't a good idea." As we continued along the path, I kept looking back over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the heat. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. When we finally reached the X-shaped structure, Tom and Keith were already there, examining it. The structure itself was bizarre. Large limbs, some 8 to 10 inches in diameter, carefully placed in an X formation, braced against standing trees. These weren't branches that had fallen naturally. They had been deliberately positioned and intertwined. Some appeared to have been snapped with tremendous force rather than cut with tools. I barely registered the structure, though. My mind was still reeling from what I'd seen. When I told Tom and Keith about our encounter, Keith's face grew serious. "How tall would you say it was?" he asked. I shook my head. I only saw the arm move, but it was high up, much higher than a normal person's arm would be. "The sapling," Michael interjected. "We need to measure that sapling. That's our reference point. We spent another hour in the area, documenting the structure and searching for any signs of the creature. Footprints, hair samples, broken branches. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves and pine needles that made tracking difficult. We found a few broken branches high up, much higher than a human could reach without tools, but nothing conclusive. The feeling of being watched never left. Several times, we heard the same deliberate movement in the surrounding forest, always just out of sight. It seemed to be circling us, keeping its distance, but monitoring our activity. As the afternoon wore on, an unspoken agreement passed between us. It was time to leave. The forest suddenly felt unwelcoming, as if we were trespassing in someone else's territory. The hike back was tense and hurried. No one wanted to be caught in those woods after dark. That night, I barely slept. The image of that hair-covered arm, moving so deliberately, so intelligently, played on repeat in my mind. I've spent my entire career studying wildlife, and nothing I'd ever encountered moved like that. The next morning, I convinced my friend Ryan, an experienced tracker and former forest ranger, to return to the site with me. I needed verification, measurements, something concrete to help me make sense of what I'd seen. When we reached the sapling, Ryan measured it at just under 11 feet tall. The arm movement I'd witnessed had occurred at approximately 9 feet off the ground. Whatever I saw, it stood well over 10 feet tall. Ryan examined the area thoroughly and found subtle signs I had missed. Broken vegetation in a pattern that suggested a large biped had moved through, consistent with the direction the creature had retreated. There were no clear footprints, but there were compressed areas in the leaf litter that didn't match any known wildlife pattern. It's been years since that day, and I still don't know how to process what I saw. I've gone through every possible explanation. A bear, a person in a costume, a trick of light and shadow. None fit what Michael and I witnessed. What haunts me most isn't just the creature itself, but how it moved, with purpose, intelligence, and an awareness of us that felt unsettlingly human. It knew exactly when to retreat, exactly how to stay hidden while observing us. It displayed a level of intelligence that sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. I've returned to those woods many times since then, always with recording equipment, always hoping for another glimpse to validate what I saw. I never found anything conclusive, just more broken branches too high up, more of those strange X structures deeper in the forest, and that persistent feeling of being watched. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story before my experience, I would have nodded politely while mentally filing them under overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I can still see that massive hair-covered arm catching the sunlight as it bent at the elbow, still feel the electric fear that shot through me when I realized I was looking at something science hasn't acknowledged. The forest doesn't feel the same to me anymore. Every time I'm out there alone for my research, I find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. Something is out there, something intelligent that has learned to exist alongside us without being seen. And now I can't stop wondering how many times it's watched me when I didn't notice. Story 11. I still think about that day, back in the summer of 2004. I was just 8 years old, and my little sister Emma was 7. We were living outside Colfax, Wisconsin at the time. Our house sat at the edge of about 30 acres of woods, with a small creek running through the back part of the property. Mom and Dad would let us play back there as long as we stayed within shouting distance of the house and didn't go past the old oak tree that marked the border of our land. That particular day was hot, the kind of sticky Wisconsin summer heat that makes your t-shirt cling to your back. School had been out for a couple weeks, and Emma and I had settled into our summer routine of exploring, catching bugs, and splashing around in the shallow parts of the creek. Dad had given us each a mason jar with holes punched in the lids so we could catch tadpoles. We'd been down at this little slough area. It was a slow-moving part of the creek that formed a sort of muddy pool where frogs would lay their eggs. The water was only ankle-deep there, perfect for spotting tadpoles wiggling around. I remember the mud squishing between my toes as we crouched down, carefully dipping our jars into the murky water. I was totally focused on trying to scoop up this one fat tadpole that kept darting away from my jar. The sun was beating down on my back, mosquitoes buzzing around my ears. I must have been hunched over for a good 5 minutes, determined to catch that one particular tadpole. Emma had wandered a few feet away, working on filling her own jar. I'll never forget what happened next. There was this weird moment where everything seemed to get quieter. I didn't notice it right away, but looking back, the usual background noise of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, just stopped. It was like someone had turned down the volume knob on the whole forest. Then I heard Emma make this small sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a whimper, but something in between. When I turned to look at her, she was completely frozen, staring past me toward the edge of the trees, maybe 15 feet away from where we were playing. Her face, God, I'll never forget her face. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth slightly parted, and she'd gone completely pale. She didn't scream or point or anything dramatic like that. She just stared for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple seconds. I was about to ask her what was wrong when she suddenly stood up and bolted. She didn't say a word, didn't look back, just took off running toward home. I instantly knew something was seriously wrong. Emma wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and she definitely wasn't the type to leave me behind. I turned around to look at whatever had scared her, and that's when I saw it. Standing right at the edge where the slough met the tree line was something tall, something covered in white hair. It was standing upright on 2 legs like a person, but everything else about it was just wrong. The hair covering its body was long and thick, not patchy or uneven like a costume would be. It was a startling white color, almost glowing in the afternoon sun. I'd never seen anything like it. The hair seemed to cover its entire body uniformly. I couldn't see a face because of how it was standing partly turned away from me, just this massive, white-haired figure. What really struck me, even in that moment of pure terror, were its arms. They hung down way longer than any normal person's arms should. They seemed to reach almost to its knees, and there was something about the way it was built, this powerful, solid mass, that my brain immediately registered as not human. I didn't think. I didn't analyze. Every instinct in my body screamed danger, and I took off after Emma. I dropped my jar right there in the mud and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. The weirdest part was that I didn't hear anything behind me. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. Just that unnatural silence. I caught up to Emma about halfway to the house. We sprinted across the yard and burst through the back door into the kitchen where Mom and Dad were making lunch. We were both breathless, talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. "There's something in the woods," Emma kept saying. "By the creek, a white thing, it was watching us," I added. At first, Mom and Dad looked confused, maybe thinking we were playing some kind of game, but something in our faces must have convinced them we weren't making it up. Dad's expression changed from confused to concerned. He put his hands on my shoulders and told me to slow down and explain exactly what we saw. I remember struggling to find the right words. How do you describe something you've never seen before? I told them about the tall white figure by the trees, the long arms, the thick hair covering its body. Emma nodded along, adding details I'd missed, how it seemed to be watching us, how still it had been standing. Mom looked worried, but Dad tried to stay practical. He suggested we all go back to the creek together to check it out. Part of me was terrified to go back, but having Dad with us made it seem safer. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet just in case, and we all headed out the back door. The walk to the creek felt like it took forever. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. When we got to the slough, our mason jars were still there, mine tipped over in the mud where I'd dropped it. But the white figure was gone. Dad walked the perimeter of the area, looking for tracks or signs that something had been there. Mom stayed with Emma and me, holding our hands tightly. The woods felt different now, too quiet, too still. No frogs croaking, no birds singing. Where exactly was it standing? Dad asked, and Emma and I both pointed to the same spot at the edge of the tree line. Dad walked over there and crouched down, examining the ground. He stood up after a minute and shook his head. "The ground's too hard here to see footprints," he said. "Could have been a deer standing on its hind legs, or maybe a bear." But we both knew it wasn't either of those things. It stood too straight, too tall, and the white hair, neither of us had ever seen an animal with hair like that. We didn't stay long. Dad seemed eager to get us back to the house, and honestly, I was relieved. As we walked back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that white figure following us, but there was nothing there. That night, Mom and Dad had a long talk with us. They believed we'd seen something that scared us, but they weren't sure what it was. Dad suggested it might have been someone from one of the neighboring properties walking through the woods, maybe wearing some kind of white work coveralls or something. But then they said something that struck me as odd. They told us not to talk about what we'd seen with our friends at school or with the neighbors. Dad said people might get the wrong idea or think you're just making up stories. Looking back now, I wonder if they were trying to protect us from being labeled as the weird kids who saw monsters in the woods, or maybe they believed us more than they let on. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I kept imagining that white figure standing outside my window, those unnaturally long arms reaching toward the glass. Emma started sleeping in my room, both of us finding comfort in not being alone. Mom and Dad didn't stop us from playing in the yard, but they were stricter about us staying close to the house. The creek was off limits for the rest of that summer. As time passed, the memory didn't fade like most childhood experiences do. It stayed sharp, detailed, burned into my mind. Emma and I would sometimes talk about it in whispers, comparing what we remembered, making sure we weren't crazy or hadn't imagined it. Years later, when I was in high school, I stumbled across a book about cryptids and unexplained phenomena in the school library. Flipping through it, I found a section on Bigfoot sightings. Most descriptions mentioned creatures with dark brown or black hair, but there was one account from northern Minnesota that described an abnormally pale specimen, possibly an albino. My hands shook as I read that. I checked out the book and showed it to Emma that night. We sat on my bed and pored over the pages, recognizing elements from our own experience. The unusual silence in the woods, the proportions of the creature, the immediate sense of fear it provoked. "Do you think that's what we saw?" Emma asked. "Some kind of Bigfoot?" I didn't have an answer then, and honestly, I still don't now. All I know is what we experienced was real. The white figure by the creek wasn't a man in a costume. The proportions were all wrong, the hair too even and natural. It wasn't a bear or any other animal native to Wisconsin. It was something else entirely. Emma and I are adults now. She's a nurse in Minneapolis, and I work in IT in Madison. We don't see each other as often as we'd like, but whenever we do get together, the conversation eventually circles back to that summer day by the creek. Our memories haven't changed or faded. We both still remember the white-haired creature with perfect clarity. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what we saw, but the questions that remain unanswered. Was it watching us specifically? Had it been there other times when we were playing, observing us without our knowledge? What would have happened if Emma hadn't looked up when she did? I've read more accounts of Bigfoot sightings over the years. Most describe creatures much larger than what we saw, 7 to 9 feet tall, while ours was maybe 6 feet. and the white coloration seems to be extremely rare. Was it an albino, an elderly specimen, something else entirely? We never saw it again after that day, despite living in that house for 3 more years. But sometimes when I visit my parents who still live in the same place, I find myself staring out toward the creek, half expecting to catch a glimpse of white moving between the trees. I've never told this story publicly before. Even now, I feel a strange hesitation, like breaking the silence might somehow summon it back. But I need to know if anyone else has seen something similar, a white-haired, long-armed figure in the woods of western Wisconsin. I need to know we weren't the only ones, because even now, 20 years later, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in those woods it's still there, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder if someday someone else will look up from their innocent play to find those long arms and that white hair at the edge of their vision. Story 12. I've never shared this publicly before, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened at our home in Thetford, Vermont, back in 2015, still keeps me up some nights. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. I almost wish I didn't believe it myself. We moved to that house when I was 16. It was perfect. A nice 2-story place with a huge backyard that opened onto this massive 20-acre field. Beyond that was nothing but dense Vermont forest stretching for miles. My parents loved the privacy, and I loved having all that space to mess around in. My dad worked for a lumber company in the area, and Mom taught at the elementary school in town. We'd been there about 3 years when everything happened. It was late August, one of those perfect late summer evenings when the air starts getting that first hint of fall crispness. The sun was just starting to set, painting everything golden. I was in my room playing Xbox when our golden retriever, Buddy, started absolutely losing his mind downstairs. Not his normal "someone's at the door" bark. This was frantic, almost panicked barking I'd never heard from him before. Mom yelled up asking if I could check what was going on since she was in the middle of cooking dinner. I remember being annoyed about having to stop my game, but the way Buddy was barking was honestly unsettling. When I got downstairs, Buddy was at the back door, hackles raised, barking non-stop at something outside. I looked through the glass door and didn't see anything at first. I stepped outside onto our back deck, and Buddy wouldn't follow me. He just stayed at the threshold, still barking. That's when I noticed movement in the field. 6 or 7 deer were sprinting full tilt across the middle of the field toward the forest. We saw deer all the time, but never running like this. They were in absolute panic mode, bounding through the tall grass like their lives depended on it. Something felt wrong. The hair on my arm stood up, and then I saw it. Behind the deer, maybe 50 yards back, something huge was moving through the grass. The field grass was about 4 feet tall at that point in summer, and whatever this was stood well above it. It was running on 2 legs, with a gait unlike anything I'd ever seen. These long, powerful strides that ate up ground at an incredible rate. Dark hair covered its body, not black, more like a deep brown. Its arms swung low at its sides as it ran, almost reaching its knees. The weirdest part was its proportions. Its head sat low on these massive shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. It was bulky but moved with this purpose. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't making any noise I could hear over Buddy's barking, but you could see the grass parting forcefully as it moved. I stood there, frozen, watching it follow the deer right to the tree line. It never slowed down, just disappeared into the forest after them. The whole thing probably lasted 20 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. When it was gone, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Buddy had finally stopped barking but was whining at my feet. I went back inside, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely close the door. "What was it?" Mom asked from the kitchen. I just mumbled something about a coyote chasing deer. I didn't know what to say. "How do you tell your family you just saw what looked like a Sasquatch running through your backyard?" They'd think I was crazy or playing a prank. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my head. I've hunted with my dad since I was 12. I know what bears look like when they run. I know what every animal in these woods looks like. This wasn't anything I recognized. I didn't tell anyone for a couple weeks. I convinced myself maybe I'd seen things wrong. Maybe it was a bear standing momentarily, or maybe the angle made some normal animal look weird. But deep down, I knew what I saw. About 3 weeks later, my buddy Ryan came over to hang out. Ryan and I had been friends since middle school, and he lived about 2 miles down the road. We decided to have a fire in the backyard fire pit. It was around 9 o'clock, already dark, and we were just chilling, talking about senior year starting soon. We heard coyotes yipping and howling in the northeast corner of the field. This was pretty normal. We heard them all the time. What wasn't normal was what happened next. From the complete opposite corner of the field, near where the tree line curved in, came this sound that made my blood run cold. It was this high-pitched screech that turned into almost a wail. I can't even properly describe it. Kind of like if you combined a woman screaming with the sound a fox makes, but way louder and more deliberate. The coyotes went dead silent instantly. Then everything went quiet. I mean everything. No crickets, no frogs from the pond down the hill, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire property. Ryan looked at me with wide eyes. "What the actual hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, but my stomach was in knots because I was starting to think maybe I did know. "Dude, I've never heard anything make a sound like that," Ryan said. He looked genuinely freaked out, and Ryan's not the type to get scared easily. We stayed by the fire another hour, but nothing else happened. The normal night sounds eventually came back, but the coyotes didn't make another peep all night. When Ryan left, I almost told him about what I'd seen weeks earlier, but I held back. I still felt crazy even thinking about it. About a month after the first sighting, so this would have been late September, Ryan came over again on a Saturday afternoon. We were bored and decided to hit some golf balls into the field. My dad had an old set of clubs, and we'd sometimes see who could drive the ball furthest. The grass in the field was even taller now, easily 5 feet in most spots. We'd been out there maybe 20 minutes when Ryan suddenly stopped mid-swing. "Connor, look over there," he said quietly, pointing toward the far end of the field where it met the forest. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed some movement in the grass near the tree line, maybe 200 yards away. The grass was swaying in one spot, but there wasn't any wind. As we watched, something stood up from within the grass. My heart dropped into my stomach. It rose up until it was visible from about the waist up. It was covered in the same dark brown hair I'd seen before. In the daylight, I could see it better. Its body was massive. Broad shoulders, thick torso. I couldn't make out its face clearly at that distance, but I could tell its head was angled in our direction. It just stood there, completely still, for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, without any rush, it turned and began walking toward the trees with these smooth, deliberate steps. You could see the tall grass shifting as it moved, making a path straight to the forest. It never looked back at us. Never made any sound. It just walked into the trees and vanished. Ryan's golf club slipped from his hands and clattered on the ground. "Tell me you saw that," he whispered. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." "That wasn't a person, Connor." His voice was shaking. "I know." We went back inside immediately. Ryan was pale, and to be honest, I probably was too. We sat in my kitchen, trying to process what we'd just seen. That looked like... Ryan couldn't even get the words out. "A Sasquatch," I finished for him. "I saw it once before, about 2 months ago. It was chasing deer across the field." Ryan just stared at me. "Why didn't you say anything?" "So, would you have believed me?" I asked. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. That night after Ryan went home, I finally decided to talk to my dad. We were sitting in the living room watching TV, and I just blurted it out, told him everything I'd seen and what Ryan and I had witnessed that day. I expected him to laugh or tell me we were seeing things. Instead, he got really quiet and turned off the TV. "I've never told anyone this," he said finally. "Not even your mom. When I was about 12, my dad owned this same property. We had a smaller house back then, but it was right here where ours is now." I felt a chill run down my spine. One night I was out late collecting fireflies in a jar. This would have been in the 70s. I saw something by the tree line, a huge, hairy figure walking on two legs. It was dark, but I could see it clearly in the moonlight. It was at least 7 feet tall. I ran inside and told my dad, but he said I was just seeing shadows. We sat in silence for a while after that. "You believe me?" I finally asked. "I believe you saw something," he said carefully. "Same thing I saw all those years ago. I don't know what it is, but this property has always had strange things happen." Dad made me promise not to tell Mom. She'd just worry. He also suggested we not go into the field alone, especially near dusk or dawn. I agreed immediately. Over the next few weeks, we didn't see the creature again, but there were signs. Weird broken branches high up in trees at the edge of our property. One morning, we found a line of huge, barefoot-looking prints crossing our driveway after a rainy night. They were at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep in the mud, like whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. They disappeared when they hit the gravel section of our drive. We never set up cameras or tried to get proof. Something about it felt wrong, like we shouldn't interfere or try to expose whatever was out there. It was sharing the land with us, and it hadn't tried to harm us. I went to college the next year and moved away from Thetford. My parents still live in that house. When I visit, I always find myself looking out toward that field and the tree line beyond, wondering if it's still out there. To this day, I have no explanation for what we saw. I know what a bear looks like. I know what every animal native to Vermont looks like. This wasn't any of those. Between the multiple sightings, that bone-chilling screech we heard, and my dad's story from decades earlier, I'm convinced we had a Sasquatch regularly moving through our property. I don't expect anyone to believe this. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I believe it myself, but I know what I saw. And sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment hundreds of miles away, I still hear that screech in my dreams. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened 7 years ago. My family lived in this old farmhouse about 2 miles from Spruill State Forest in central Pennsylvania. It was pretty isolated. Nothing but woods, fields, and maybe 3 neighbors within a mile radius. That November in 2016 changed everything for us. And honestly, I still have trouble sleeping some nights. It was a weirdly warm day for November. Me, my sister Emma, 14, and my little brother Caleb, 8, were playing in the yard while Mum was inside making dinner. Our property backed up against this huge cornfield that had just been harvested, so it was all stubble and dirt mounds. We were tossing a football around when Emma suddenly stopped and pointed toward the field. "What is that?" she asked, squinting. I turned and saw it immediately. Standing maybe 200 yards away, at the edge where the field met the tree line, was this tall, black figure. Just standing there, watching us, I remember feeling like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Is that a person?" Caleb asked, but even he didn't sound convinced. The thing was huge, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, and completely black. Not like African-American black, but like shadow black, like it was absorbing the light around it. It was just standing there, perfectly still, watching our house. Emma, always the brave one, suddenly yelled, "Hey!" at the top of her lungs. The figure didn't move at first, and then it turned slightly, not like a person turns, but almost like it rotated its entire body at once. That's when our dog Max, this big German Shepherd mix, started barking like crazy and took off across the field toward it. The next few seconds are burned into my memory. Our mom burst through the back door, took one look at what was happening, and her face just drained of all color. "Get inside now," she screamed. Not yelled, screamed. I'd never heard that tone in her voice before. It was pure terror. We all ran inside, even as Max was still tearing across the field toward that thing. Mum slammed the door behind us and locked it, then rushed around closing all the blinds. "Mum, what about Max?" Caleb was crying. "He'll come back," she said, but her voice was shaking. "Stay away from the windows." Max did come back about 20 minutes later, whimpering and shaking. He wouldn't leave the house for days after that. Mum didn't talk about what happened, just said it was probably a hunter trespassing and to forget about it. But 2 days later, Caleb and I were messing around in this old hog pen next to our house. It hadn't been used in years, just an empty concrete enclosure with a small hog house attached. We found these weird impressions in the dirt, like footprints, but not quite right. They were huge and deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We followed the tracks to the entrance of the old hog house, and there in a patch of soft dirt was this single perfect footprint. I'll never forget it. It was easily 16 inches long, maybe more, with 2 distinct toe impressions at the front. Not 5 toes like a human, just 2 big ones. The impression was so deep that whatever made it must have weighed hundreds of pounds. I called my mom and Emma out to see it. Mom's face went white again, and she took pictures with her phone. We searched around more and found something else. Stuck to a jagged piece of metal near a small window in the hog house was a clump of hair. Dark, coarse hair, almost like horsehair, but different somehow. When I picked it up, this strong, musky smell hit me, not like any animal I knew. It smelled wild and foreign, like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Mom put the hair in a Ziploc bag. I still have it somewhere, although the smell has faded over the years. That night at dinner, Mom finally talked about what happened. "I want you all to stay close to the house for a while," she said. "No playing in the fields or the woods until I say it's okay." "Was it a bear?" Emma asked. Mom hesitated. "I don't think so." "Then what was it?" I pressed. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it's big, and I don't want any of you near it." That's when things really started getting weird. Mom began waking us up in the middle of the night because she heard noises outside. The first time, it was around 2 in the morning. She came into my room shaking me awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened and heard what sounded like chains dragging across our concrete porch, slow, deliberate dragging. Then it stopped, and there was silence for maybe 30 seconds before our front door handle started jiggling. Not like someone trying to break in, but like something was curiously testing it, trying to understand how it worked. We were all huddled in my room. Mom, Emma, Caleb, and me. Even Max was hiding under my bed, whimpering. Mom had her phone in one hand and Dad's old baseball bat in the other. Dad had passed away 2 years earlier, so it was just us out there in that isolated farmhouse. The jiggling stopped, and then we heard footsteps crossing our wooden porch, heavy footsteps that made the boards creak like they were about to snap. Whatever it was walked the entire length of our porch, stopping at each window. I could hear sniffing, like it was trying to smell inside. And then came the growl. Not like a dog or even a bear. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like it was coming from something with a chest the size of a barrel. It was right outside my bedroom window, which faced the back of the house. The window was closed and locked, with the blinds drawn, but I swear I could feel the vibration of that growl in my bones. Mom called the police, but by the time they arrived almost 40 minutes later, whatever it was had disappeared. The officer looked around with his flashlight, found some mud on our porch, and said it was probably just a bear or a coyote. But the way he kept looking toward the tree line made me think he wasn't convinced of his own explanation. This continued for almost 2 weeks, not every night, but at least every second or third night. Sometimes it would just be footsteps, other times, the growling. Once, something scraped against the side of the house, from ground level all the way up to the roof. a distance of at least 15 feet. One morning, we found our trash cans had been emptied out, but not torn apart like animals usually do. It was like someone had carefully removed each item, examined it, and placed it on the ground. Nothing was eaten or taken. Mom started researching online, making phone calls to wildlife experts. She wouldn't tell us what she was looking into, but I saw her computer history once. Searches about Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, reports of black figure encounters in central PA forests. The final incident happened about 3 weeks after our first sighting. We were all in the living room watching TV when the power suddenly went out. This wasn't unusual. Living rural meant power outages happened during bad weather. But it was a clear, calm night. Mom got the flashlights and we were about to check the breaker box when we heard something on the roof. Heavy footsteps moving across the shingles, so powerful that dust and small bits of ceiling insulation sprinkled down on us. The footsteps crossed to the chimney, and then we heard something that still makes my skin crawl. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to be trying to mimic words. Not English, not any language, but definitely patterned sounds, like it was attempting communication. Max started going crazy, barking and howling, when suddenly he just stopped and crawled under the couch, trembling. Then came a tremendous slam on our front door. Not a knock, but like something had thrown its entire body against it. The door frame cracked, and the door itself bowed inward, though it didn't break. Mom rushed us all into the bathroom, the only room without windows, and locked the door. We could hear more movement outside around the house, and then silence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the power came back on. We cautiously emerged and found our front door damaged but intact. Outside, in the porch light, we could see these huge, strange footprints in the mud around our house, the same kind we'd found in the hog pen. We moved away 3 months later. Mom said it was for a better job, but I know the real reason. The forest around our home no longer felt safe. Looking back now, almost 7 years later, I've done a lot of research. I've compared our experiences with others, looked at the hair sample under a friend's microscope in college. I've become convinced that what we encountered was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot. The height, the black figure, the footprints with just 2 toes visible, the incredible strength, the curious but intimidating behavior, it all fits. Some people tell me it was just a bear, or my imagination, or that my mom was just being paranoid after my dad died. But they didn't see that figure standing in the field. They didn't hear those sounds or feel the presence of something massive and intelligent watching our house night after night. I still have nightmares about it. In them, I'm standing in that cornfield, and instead of the creature being far away, it's right in front of me, and it speaks in that same rumbling attempt at language we heard that final night. I never understand what it's trying to say, but in the dream, I feel like it's important, like it was trying to tell us something. I don't know why it came to our house or what it wanted. Maybe our property was part of its territory. Maybe it was just curious about us. But whatever the reason, for those few weeks in November 2016, something from the ancient forests of Pennsylvania took an interest in our family. And not a day goes by that I don't wonder if it's still out there, watching from the tree line, waiting. Story 14. I've never really told this story to many people. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a little. It happened back in September of 1982 when I was 15, but I can still remember every detail like it was yesterday. I grew up in Mecosta County, Michigan, in one of those resort areas that's built around a bunch of swampy lakes. Our house was on the outskirts, with these big stretches of forest between clusters of homes. Looking back, it was actually the perfect place for something to hide if it didn't want to be found. That night, I'd been over at my friend Eric's house. We were playing Atari games and lost track of time. His mom finally kicked me out around 11 at night, saying it was a school night. I didn't mind. I'd walked home from his place hundreds of times before. There were 2 ways to get home from Eric's. Follow the main road, which wound around for about 20 minutes, or cut through this path in the woods that would get me home in maybe 10 minutes. I'd taken that shortcut a million times, during the day, at dusk, even at night sometimes. But that night, something felt different. As I stood at the fork where I needed to decide which way to go, I got this weird feeling in my gut, like something was telling me to take the road. But 15-year-old me thought that was stupid. Why add 10 extra minutes to my walk when I knew the shortcut like the back of my hand? So I ignored that feeling and headed down the path. The trail cut along this ridge, maybe 200 yards from this swampy lagoon area below. Normally, I could at least see outlines of trees and stuff from moonlight, but that night was pitch black. No moon, cloudy sky. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The only reason I could stay on the path was because I'd walked it so many times before. I remember the sounds around me seemed different. Usually you'd hear frogs, crickets, maybe an owl. But everything was super quiet. That should have been my second warning, but I just kept going. The path was about a quarter-mile long. I was probably 3/4 of the way through when it happened. I stopped for a second because I thought I heard something, like a shuffling sound ahead of me on the path. I couldn't see anything. It was just too dark, but I had this overwhelming sense that something was there, right in front of me, just standing there. Then it happened. This scream erupted from about 20 or 30 feet ahead of me on the path. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was this high-pitched, piercing shriek that went straight through me. It was so loud it physically hurt my ears. My whole body just locked up. The scream couldn't have lasted more than a couple seconds, but it felt like forever. Then there was this massive crashing sound, like something big was plowing through the underbrush. Whatever it was running down the hill toward the lagoon. The way it moved was all wrong. It covered the distance to the water in like 3 or 4 bounds. That hill was steep. It would have taken me 30 seconds to carefully pick my way down. This thing did it in maybe 2 seconds flat. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning and I could feel my heart practically exploding in my chest. I don't think my feet even touched the ground. I just flew out of those woods and didn't stop until I got home. I burst through our back door and slammed it behind me. My mom was still up watching TV, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I was ghost white, drenched in sweat, and could barely speak. When she asked what happened, I just mumbled something about getting spooked in the dark. I didn't know how to explain what I'd just experienced. That night, I kept the lights on in my room. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream again. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since, like a woman's scream, but way louder and more powerful than any human could possibly make. There was something almost primal about it. The next day at school, I was a mess, couldn't focus, kept jumping at every noise. My friends noticed and asked what was up, but I just said I'd had a nightmare. I didn't know how to tell them what had happened without sounding crazy. For weeks afterward, I took the long way home. No way was I going near that path again. I kept trying to convince myself that I'd just startled a deer or something. But I knew that wasn't right. I'd grown up around deer my whole life. They snort or make this blowing sound when they're scared. They don't scream like that. Nothing natural screams like that. My dad was big into hunting, so I knew all the wildlife in our area. It wasn't a bobcat or a coyote or anything else that should have been in those woods. The sound was just wrong, and the way it moved, that's what really got to me. The speed and power it had going down that hill. No deer or bear moves like that. About a month later, I finally worked up the courage to go back to that spot during the daytime with my friend Rob. I told him I thought I'd seen something weird there, but I didn't give him details. We checked around the area where I'd heard the scream, and then down by the lagoon. We found these weird impressions in the mud near the water. They were kind of washed out from rain we'd had, but they were big, way bigger than my dad's boots, and spaced really far apart, like whatever made them had been taking massive strides or jumps. Rob thought they were just from some local guys who went fishing down there, but the spacing was all wrong. Nobody takes 7-foot strides while carrying fishing gear. For years, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd spooked myself in the dark. But I knew better. There was something in those woods that night, something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, around 1997 or so, that I heard a recording online that made my blood run cold. I was on one of those early internet forums where people shared weird experiences, and someone had posted audio recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls. When I played one of them, every hair on my body stood up. It was that same high-pitched, powerful scream I'd heard that night, the same unnatural quality to it. I must have replayed it 50 times, and each time I got that same sinking feeling in my stomach. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent years telling myself I'm crazy, that I just heard some weird animal, or maybe even a person playing a prank. But deep down, I know what I experienced. Looking back, our area was perfect for something like that to live. Those lakes and swamps created these natural corridors through the woods. Lots of game, plenty of water, and enough distance between houses that something could move around without being seen much. During hunting season, anything with half a brain would know to stay deep in those swampy areas where most hunters wouldn't bother going. The weird thing is, I've talked to a few other people from the area over the years who had strange experiences too. One old-timer who lived near us told me he used to find deer carcasses in weird places, up in trees or with parts missing, in ways that didn't make sense for normal predators. He always blamed it on teenagers, but the way he said it made me think he didn't really believe that. A couple years after my experience, a family about 3 miles from us reported that something had torn the door off their shed. The police said it was vandals, but the father told my dad privately that the door had been ripped off from the outside, with the hinges bent outward. That would take incredible strength. I moved away from Michigan after college and haven't been back to those specific woods since. Part of me wants to go back someday to see if I feel anything. Another part of me is still that terrified 15-year-old running through the dark. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I can't prove anything. All I know is what I heard and the fear I felt. That scream wasn't natural. The way it moved wasn't natural. And sometimes, when I'm having trouble sleeping and the house is quiet, I can still hear it echoing in my head. To this day, I can't walk in dark woods alone. The sound of branches breaking at night makes my heart race, and whenever I hear stories about Bigfoot or other creatures, I don't laugh them off like most people do, because I know there are things out there we don't understand. I met one of them on that path in 1982, and I've never been the same since. Die sunt Story 15, Sasal. It happened on a Friday night in October of 1996. I was walking home from my friend Jessica's house around 11:30 at night. This was in a small town in northern Pennsylvania where everybody knew everybody, and parents didn't worry too much about their kids walking around alone, even after dark. The route from Jessica's to my house was about a mile, and included this quarter-mile stretch that cut through a wooded area. I'd walked it hundreds of times before, in all kinds of weather and at all hours, so I didn't think twice about it. That night was actually really nice. The moon was full and super bright, lighting up the path so well I barely needed to use the little flashlight I carried. It was chilly but not cold yet, typical October weather where you just need a light jacket. I remember I was wearing my favorite denim jacket with patches on it that I thought made me look cool. The first part of the walk was completely normal. I was just thinking about homework and some stupid drama at school, normal teenage stuff. Jessica and I had spent the evening watching horror movies and eating pizza, and I was in a pretty good mood despite the late hour. I remember checking my watch as I reached the start of the wooded section, thinking my mom would probably still be up when I got home. I was about halfway through the woods when I noticed something weird. It's hard to explain, but suddenly everything got really quiet, like unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no distant traffic sounds, nothing. It wasn't gradual either. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. I actually stopped walking for a second because it was so noticeable. That's when I got my first real chill. Not from the cold, but just this instinctive feeling that something wasn't right. You know that feeling you get when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I started walking again, a bit faster now, and that's when I passed this old chain-link fence on my right. It separated the road from private property, some abandoned farmland that nobody had developed yet. The fence was rusted and sagging in places, barely visible in some spots, where bushes and vines had grown through it. That's when I saw them. The eyes. They were about 7 or 8 feet up from the ground, which was the first thing that struck me as odd. They were moving slowly from side to side, like whatever they belonged to was scanning the area, but the most unsettling thing was the color. This deep, glowing red. Not like when you shine a flashlight on a deer or cat and get that yellowish-green reflection. This was different. The red seemed to come from within, like the eyes themselves were generating the light. I froze. Completely froze. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I just stood there, staring at those eyes, and they stared right back at me. Time seemed to stretch out forever in that moment. Then it moved. Whatever it was, it took a step forward, closer to the fence. It was maybe 30 feet off the road, partially hidden by brush and trees. But when it stepped forward, the moonlight hit it just enough that I could make out its shape. And that's when true fear hit me. This thing was massive, just absolutely huge. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It had this oversized head with what looked like a pronounced brow ridge, kind of like those old caveman pictures in textbooks, but way more intimidating. The head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. I couldn't see any neck at all. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, like a linebacker but bigger, and it was covered in what looked like long, dark hair or fur, covering most of its body, except for around the eyes and nose, where I could see what looked like skin. I remember thinking it couldn't be real. It had to be some guy in a costume playing a prank, but the way it moved, it was too fluid, too natural. And who would be hiding in the woods at midnight just to scare random people? It didn't make sense. The craziest part was that it made no aggressive moves toward me. It just stood there, watching me with those red eyes. I had the overwhelming sense that it was studying me, like I was some kind of curiosity. That was almost worse than if it had charged at me. This intelligent observation. My brain finally caught up with my body, and I knew I needed to get out of there. But I also knew enough from watching nature shows that you shouldn't turn your back on predators. So I started walking backward, slowly at first, then faster, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. I was terrified it would jump the fence and come after me, but it never did. It just stood there, watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wouldn't trip, and to see how far I was from the next streetlight at the edge of the woods. It felt like it took forever to reach that light, but it was probably only a minute or two. The whole time, I could feel those red eyes tracking me. When I finally reached the streetlight, I allowed myself one last look back. The thing was still there, still watching, and then, I swear this is true, it raised one massive arm in what almost seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement. Not waving exactly, but some kind of deliberate movement. That's when I finally turned and ran the rest of the way home. I burst through our front door, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. My mum was still up watching TV and immediately knew something was wrong. I was shaking, sweating, and could barely get words out. When I finally managed to tell her what happened, I could see she didn't believe me. She tried to be supportive, suggesting maybe I'd seen a bear, or that the horror movies had gotten to me. My dad was even worse when he heard about it the next day. He just laughed it off completely. After a few days of nobody believing me, I stopped talking about it. I started taking the long way home from Jessica's, adding an extra 20 minutes to my walk, just to avoid that wooded stretch. When people asked why, I made up excuses about wanting the exercise. For years, I tried to convince myself that maybe my parents were right. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, or my imagination playing tricks after watching scary movies. But I knew deep down what I saw. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The way it moved was too deliberate, too human-like, but not human at all. I kept the encounter secret for years after that. I didn't even tell Jessica or my other friends. I mean, how could I? Hey guys, I saw Bigfoot the other night. Yeah, right. I would have been the laughing stock of the school, so I buried it, tried to forget about it, and mostly succeeded through college and early adulthood. Then about 5 years ago, I was back visiting my parents for Thanksgiving. I was flipping through the local newspaper when I came across a small article about unusual sightings in the woods near the old Miller property, the exact area where I'd had my encounter. The article mentioned that several people had reported seeing an unusually large, hair-covered figure in those woods over the years. Some described red eyes, some mentioned the same eerie silence I'd experienced. I nearly dropped the paper. All these years, I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But here was proof that others had seen it too. I cut out that article and still have it tucked away in my desk drawer. Since then, I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot sightings, particularly in Pennsylvania. Turns out, the Appalachian region has a long history of such encounters. I've read dozens of accounts that describe details so similar to what I experienced that it gives me chills. The silence in the woods, the red eyes, the massive shoulders with no neck. I'm 38 now, and I still get nervous in the woods after dark. I've never had another encounter like that one, but I'm not exactly going looking for one either. I can't explain what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world around me. The woods I once thought I knew so well suddenly became a place of mystery and potential danger. That stretch of road that I'd walked hundreds of times before became unfamiliar territory overnight. And the most unsettling part, that property is now a housing development. Houses stand where that creature once stood. Families live there, kids play in those yards, completely unaware of what once roamed there. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, deeper in the remaining woods, watching the houses encroach on its territory. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen those red eyes staring back at them from between the trees. And sometimes on particularly dark nights when I'm alone, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive silhouette again. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw that night in '96, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. That creature was real. Those eyes were real. And somewhere out there in the forests of Pennsylvania, I believe it's still watching and waiting. Story 16. I've been meaning to share this for a while now, but honestly, I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe what happened, and I was there. This happened last October, and I still get chills thinking about it. I'm an avid hunter, been doing it since I was a kid with my dad. Nothing fancy, just deer hunting mainly. I own about 40 acres of land that borders pinewood forest, and I've been maintaining it for years, setting up salt blocks to attract deer, clearing shooting lanes, the usual stuff. That day started like any other hunting prep day. It was a crisp autumn morning, maybe around 7 o'clock. The leaves were changing and there was that earthy smell in the air that only comes in fall. I loaded up my truck with some salt blocks, the big 25-pound ones, and drove out to the clearing I've been using for years. It's this perfect spot, maybe 100 yards wide, with thick woods on 3 sides and my access road cutting in from the 4th side. I parked my F-150 at the edge of the tree line, grabbed one of the salt blocks, and started walking toward the center of the clearing where I usually place them. The grass was still wet with dew, soaking the bottom of my jeans as I trudged through it. I remember being annoyed that I forgot my rubber boots. I'd gone maybe 30 yards from my truck when something caught my eye across the clearing. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as something familiar, maybe another hunter in dark clothes, but then I froze, completely froze. About 25 yards away, walking calmly across the open ground was something I can only describe as a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. But there's no other way to describe what I was seeing. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in solid black hair, thick like a bear's, but longer. The only parts not covered in hair were its face and hands, which looked dark and leathery, almost like tanned leather, but darker. The way it walked was what struck me first, completely upright, but with this strange, fluid gait. Its arms were incredibly long, with the knuckles facing forward, swinging slightly as it moved. And its head, Jesus, it had this sloped forehead that seemed to blend right into its shoulders, which had to be at least 3 feet wide. I'm not a small guy at 6'1", but this thing made me feel tiny. If I had to guess, it weighed around 600 pounds, all muscle. The creature was walking steadily toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing, moving with this eerie calmness. It wasn't rushing, wasn't looking around nervously. It moved like it owned the place, like it had every right to be there and knew exactly where it was going. That's when I noticed the second one. At the edge of the woods where the first creature was heading, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood another identical Sasquatch. Same size, same black hair, same everything. It was just waiting there, watching the first one approach. I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to stop. The salt block in my arms felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but I couldn't move to put it down. I couldn't even breathe. I was terrified that any movement, any sound would draw their attention to me. But here's the strangest part. They never looked at me. Not once. It was like they knew I was there but didn't consider me important enough to acknowledge. There was no aggression, no curiosity, nothing. Just this deliberate indifference. I've read accounts of Bigfoot encounters where people talk about the horrible smell, but I didn't detect any odor. Maybe the wind was blowing the wrong way, or maybe those stories are exaggerated, I don't know. The first creature reached the tree line where the second one was waiting. They didn't communicate in any way that I could see. No gestures, no sounds. The first one just entered the woods, and the second one turned and followed, and then they were gone. I waited for what felt like forever, straining to hear any sound of their movement through the underbrush, but there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest returning, birds starting to chirp again, the breeze rustling leaves. When I finally got the courage to move, I didn't think about it. Pure instinct took over. I hurled the salt block over a nearby embankment. I didn't even care about placing it properly anymore, and backed up to my truck, never taking my eyes off the spot where they disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I peeled out of there, gravel flying, and didn't slow down until I hit the main road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know the difference between a bear and a man. What I saw wasn't either. Bears don't walk upright for that distance with that kind of steadiness, and no man is built like that. The proportions were all wrong, the movement too fluid and powerful. I haven't been back to that clearing since, not once. My friends think I'm crazy when I tell them I've abandoned the best hunting spot on my property. I've made up excuses. Told them I'm letting that area rest to improve the deer population, or that I'm focusing on a different section this season. But the truth is, I can't bring myself to go back there. Those creatures weren't aggressive. They didn't threaten me or even acknowledge me. But somehow that makes it worse. It was like they knew they were so far up the food chain from me that I wasn't worth noticing. They moved with the confidence of apex predators, of beings who know they won't be followed or challenged. I've thought about setting up game cameras in that area just to see if I could catch evidence of them, but something stops me every time I consider it. It feels like a violation somehow, like I'd be intruding in their space. And honestly, I'm not sure I want confirmation of what I saw. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was a hallucination or a trick of the light, but then I remember the absolute reality of those creatures. The way the grass bent under their weight, the subtle shift of muscles under that black hair. I've always been a skeptical person. I never believed in Sasquatch or Bigfoot before this. I thought those stories were just tall tales from people who'd had too much to drink or were looking for attention. Now I don't know what to believe. I just know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I'll be drifting off to sleep and suddenly jolt awake with the image of those creatures walking into the forest. The casual power in their movement, the absolute silence of their passage, the way they seem to belong to the woods in a way I never will, despite owning the property. I still hunt, but I stay on the opposite side of my land now, and sometimes, when I'm sitting in my stand waiting for deer, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement that doesn't belong. I strain my ears for footsteps too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate to be a bear. I've never told anyone the full story except my wife, who believes me but thinks I should go back. That lightning doesn't strike twice. Maybe she's right. Maybe those creatures were just passing through and are long gone now. But something in my gut tells me they're still there, moving through those woods like shadows. The thing that haunts me most isn't fear that they might hurt me. It's the realization that they've probably been there all along, watching us come and go, hunting and hiking and thinking we were alone in the woods. How many times have I been observed without knowing it? How many times have other people? And if these creatures can remain virtually undetected in a world of smartphones and trail cams and satellite imagery, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw that October morning, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Two massive creatures that shouldn't exist, walking calmly through my clearing like they'd been doing it for centuries. And maybe they have been. I sometimes wonder if I should report it to someone, but who would I even tell? I'd be laughed out of any official office, and part of me feels like I should just let them be. They didn't bother me. Why should I bother them? So I keep this story mostly to myself. I go about my life, I hunt other parts of my land, and I try not to think about what's living in those woods. But I know they're there. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest goes quiet, I wonder if they're watching me, just as indifferent to my presence as they were that day. It's been 20 years, and I've never really told anyone about that night at Camp Morrison. Maybe it's because I know how it sounds, or maybe it's because part of me still isn't sure what we actually saw. Whatever the reason, I can't stop thinking about it lately. I was 15 at the time, spending 2 weeks at Boy Scout Camp Morrison near McCall, Idaho, with Troop 256. It was my third summer there, so I knew the layout pretty well. Our troop was assigned to Camp Billy Rice near the entrance, which was good because it meant less hiking to get to the dining hall and main activities. That day had been hot, like seriously hot for Idaho, probably in the high 90s. Most of us had spent the afternoon at the waterfront, swimming and working on merit badges. I remember the counselors kept making us reapply sunscreen and drink water because a kid from another troop had gotten heat stroke the day before. My friend Michael and I were both working on our life-saving merit badge, which meant we had to stay later than the others for some extra practice. Our scoutmaster, Mr. Bennett, told us to be back before dinner, but we lost track of time. By the time we finished, the rest of our troop had already headed back to camp. "Crap, we're gonna miss dinner," Michael said, checking his watch. It was almost 6:30, and dinner started at 6. We quickly grabbed our towels and backpacks and started jogging up the trail from the lake. The sun was already starting to set behind the mountains, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. In summer, It doesn't get completely dark until after 9, but the trees made everything seem darker than it was. We were both starving and moving as fast as we could along the dirt path. They better have saved us some food, I remember saying. That's when Michael suggested we take the shortcut past Camp Idaho. It wasn't really allowed. We were supposed to stick to the main trails, but it would cut at least 15 minutes off our walk back. Mr. Bennett will be pissed if we show up super late, Michael said. Let's just cut through and nobody will know. I agreed, and we veered off onto the smaller trail that wound through the trees between the waterfront and our campsite. The path narrowed as we went, barely wide enough for one person in some spots. It was getting harder to see, and I remember wishing I'd packed my flashlight, but it was back at the tent. The shortcut took us through a part of camp I hadn't been to before. It was quieter, with taller pines and thick underbrush. The only sounds were our footsteps on the pine needles and the occasional call of birds settling in for the night. About halfway back, we came to a small wooden bridge crossing a stream, really just a few planks nailed together, barely 3 feet across. The stream was shallow, maybe ankle deep, gurgling over smooth rocks. In daylight it would have been nothing, but in the growing darkness with shadows stretching across the water, it felt different. I was about to step onto the bridge when Michael grabbed my arm. "Wait!" he whispered. "Look over there." About 20 feet downstream, near a bend where the stream widened slightly, I saw something moving. At first I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a deer getting a drink. It was hunched over by the water's edge, and in the dim light it was hard to make out details. "It's probably just a deer," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't a deer. The shape was all wrong, too big, too upright. We both stood frozen, watching. The figure was bent over the water, and I could see it was using its hands, not paws, actual hands, to scoop water to its mouth. Even from where we stood, I could hear the splashing as it drank. "What the hell is that?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the figure suddenly stopped drinking and went completely still. Then slowly, it turned its head toward us. I've tried for years to convince myself that what I saw was a bear, or a man in dark clothes, or some kind of weird shadow trick. But I know what I saw. Its face caught what little moonlight filtered through the trees, and I could see it wasn't human. The head was massive, set directly on broad shoulders with barely any neck. But it was the eyes that made my blood run cold. They had this greenish glow in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight like a cat's eyes, but much larger, and they didn't blink. Not once in what felt like forever, as it stared right at us. Then it stood up. Jesus Christ, it was tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It had these impossibly long arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its entire body was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, not like a costume, but like actual hair growing from its skin. In the patchy moonlight, the hair seemed to shimmer slightly when it moved. We all just froze there, Michael and me on one side of the stream, this thing on the other. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It just looked at us, studied us. I remember thinking it seemed almost as surprised to see us as we were to see it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't even swallow. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. I wanted to run, but couldn't make my body move. The creature and us just stared at each other for what must have been a full minute, though it felt like hours. Then, without any warning or sound, it simply turned away from us. It crouched back down by the stream and resumed scooping water to its mouth, like we weren't even worth its attention anymore. That casual dismissal somehow broke the spell of terror that had frozen us in place. Michael grabbed my arm so hard it left marks and he hissed, "Run!" We didn't even think about it. We just turned and sprinted back the way we'd come, abandoning the shortcut entirely. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life, before or since. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, both of us gasping for breath, hands on our knees. Did you see that?" Michael wheezed. I nodded, unable to speak. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. "What the hell was it?" he asked. I don't know, I finally managed. A bear, maybe. But we both knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't have hands like that. They don't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs, and they definitely don't have eyes that glow green in the darkness. We took the long way back to camp, sticking to the main trail, even though it added another 20 minutes to our journey. Neither of us wanted to risk encountering that thing again. By the time we reached Camp Billy Rice, dinner was long over. Mr. Bennett was waiting for us, ready to chew us out for being late. "Where the hell have you two been?" he demanded. "We were about to send out a search party." I opened my mouth to tell him what we'd seen, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of not being believed, or maybe it was something deeper, some instinctive understanding that what we'd witnessed wasn't something that belonged in the normal world. "Sorry, we lost track of time at the waterfront," Michael said before I could speak. "Won't happen again." Mr. Bennett lectured us about responsibility and safety, then sent us to get the leftovers the cook had saved. As we walked to the dining hall, I whispered to Michael, "Why didn't you tell him?" He just shook his head. "Would you have believed us? We'd sound crazy." He was right. What would we even say? That we saw some kind of giant, hairy creature drinking from a stream, that it had glowing eyes and hands like a human. It sounded insane even to me, and I'd seen it with my own eyes. We ate in silence, both lost in our thoughts. Later that night in our tent, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, I suggested, not believing it even as I said it. In an 8-foot costume? In this heat? "No way," Michael replied. "And those eyes, you saw how they reflected the light. That wasn't makeup." "Bigfoot," I whispered, half joking. Michael didn't laugh. "I don't know what to call it, but whatever it was, it's out there." We made a pact that night not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be the laughingstocks of the troop, and the story would follow us back home. But we also agreed to stick together for the rest of camp and avoid that area entirely. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing green eyes staring at me. Every noise outside the tent, the wind in the trees, other scouts going to the bathroom, the distant call of an owl, made me tense up, convinced the creature had followed us back to camp. The next morning, Michael suggested we go back in daylight to look for tracks or evidence, but I refused. No way was I going anywhere near that stream again, day or night. He didn't push it, and I think he was secretly relieved. For the rest of our time at Camp Morrison, we never spoke of it again, not even between ourselves. It was like we both understood that talking about it would make it more real, and neither of us wanted that. We stuck to the main trails, always returned to camp before dark, and never went anywhere alone. When camp ended and we went back home, our friendship changed. We still hung out, but there was this unspoken thing between us now, this secret knowledge that the world wasn't exactly what everyone thought it was. By the end of high school, we'd drifted apart, and after graduation, Michael moved to Oregon for college. Last I heard, he was working as an engineer in Portland. I've thought about reaching out to him over the years, just to ask if he still remembers that night, if he still thinks about what we saw. But part of me is afraid he'll say he doesn't remember, or worse, that he'll say it was just our teenage imaginations running wild. Because I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, or a person, or a trick of the light. Something was out there in those woods. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. I've never gone camping since then. I make excuses. I'm too busy. It's too expensive. I prefer hotels. But the truth is, I can't stand the thought of being in the woods after dark, of hearing that splashing sound of water being scooped by hands that aren't human, of seeing those eyes again, green and unblinking in the moonlight. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, drinking from that same stream. If other scouts have seen it over the years, If they too kept quiet about what they saw, I don't have answers. All I know is what I experienced that summer night 20 years ago, and it changed me forever. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some mysteries are better left alone in the darkness where they belong. Story 18. I've been sitting on this experience for a long time now, almost 18 years. I've only told a handful of people because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest finally. What happened to me and my friends back in 2005 still gives me nightmares. It was mid-June, right after school let out for summer break. Me, Jake, Tyler and Mike had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We were all 17, except for Mike, who had just turned 18, and we were ready for some freedom. Jake's older brother had told us about this secluded spot near Mount Adams in southern Washington. Said it was perfect. No rangers checking IDs, no other campers, just pure wilderness. The drive up there took about 3 hours from Portland. We followed Jake's brother's hand-drawn map, turning off the main highway onto increasingly narrower roads until we hit this old logging access road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. We had to park about half a mile from the actual campsite because the road was too rough for Mike's old Honda Civic. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we finally reached the clearing. The spot was perfect. A small open area surrounded by these massive Douglas firs and cedars. You could just see the peak of Mount Adams through a gap in the trees. The forest around us was so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet in before everything just turned to shadows. We spent the afternoon setting up our 2 tents, building a proper fire pit with rocks we collected and gathering firewood. Tyler and I hiked down to a small creek about 1/4 mile away to fill our water jugs, while Jake and Mike set up the food supplies in a tree to keep it away from animals. Basic camping stuff, you know. Everything was awesome at first. We grilled hot dogs and burgers on the fire, drank a few beers Jake's brother had bought us. I know we were underage, whatever. And just talked about stupid stuff. Girls from school, what colleges we were thinking about, bands we were into, normal teenage crap. The sun started setting around 8:30 and the forest got dark fast, like unnaturally fast. By 9 it was pitch black except for our campfire. We had a couple flashlights and a battery-powered lantern, but beyond our little circle of light was just nothing, complete darkness. I remember feeling on edge even before anything happened. There was something about the silence. Usually in forests at night, you hear all kinds of sounds, insects, owls, small animals rustling around, but there was almost nothing, just the occasional distant hoot of an owl and the crackling of our fire. Around 10:30, we were still sitting around the fire telling ghost stories like the cliché teenagers we were. That's when we heard it. Movement in the brush about 30 yards behind my tent. Heavy movement. Not like a squirrel or raccoon. This sounded big, like branches being pushed aside by something substantial. "Did you guys hear that?" Tyler whispered. We all nodded, suddenly alert. Mike grabbed his flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but as soon as he shined it that direction, the noise stopped. Completely, like whatever it was, knew we were listening and froze. "Probably just a deer," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We tried to go back to our conversation, but we were all on edge now, constantly glancing toward the dark tree line. Then, about 5 minutes later, we heard a loud snap, like a thick branch breaking under significant weight. It came from a different direction than the first sound, more to our right. Before anyone could say anything, something small hit the ground near our fire with a thud. Mike pointed his flashlight at it. It was a rock about the size of a tennis ball, just sitting there like it had been tossed. "What the fuck?" Jake said, standing up. That's when we heard the scream. I've spent years trying to find the right words to describe it, and I still can't do it justice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. It started low and guttural, then rose to this powerful, echoing howl that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It was coming from the trees directly across the clearing, from where we'd heard the first movement. I literally felt the hair on my arms stand up. Mike dropped his flashlight. Tyler actually whimpered. We were frozen, staring into the darkness where the sound had come from. "We need to go," I said, finally finding my voice. "Right now." But before we could move, another rock landed in our camp, then another from a completely different direction. They weren't thrown hard enough to hurt us, but the message was clear. We were surrounded. We could hear movement now from multiple directions, heavy footsteps breaking twigs, branches moving. Whatever was out there was circling our clearing, staying just out of the light. "Guys," Tyler's voice was shaking, "there's more than one." We started grabbing essential stuff, our backpacks, the car keys, flashlights. That's when we heard another heavy snap, but this one was above us. We looked up just in time to see a massive branch, I swear it was at least 6 inches thick, come crashing down right next to my tent, missing it by maybe 2 feet. That was it. We completely panicked. Grabbing only what was in our hands, we bolted toward the path that led back to the car. Mike was in front with the flashlight, then me, Tyler, and Jake bringing up the rear. The path was narrow and rough, with roots and rocks that were easy to trip on, especially running in the dark with only one decent flashlight between us. The whole time we ran, we could hear them following us. Not on the path, but moving through the forest alongside us, breaking branches, heavy footsteps pounding the ground, fast, way too fast for how dense that forest was. About halfway to the car, another scream cut through the night, much closer this time. It sounded like it was right behind Jake. He yelled and stumbled, nearly falling. I grabbed his arm and pulled him along. "Don't stop," I screamed. "Keep running." Those were the longest 5 minutes of my life. My lungs were burning. My heart felt like it was going to explode, and every nerve in my body was screaming that something was right behind us, about to grab us at any second. When we finally broke through the trees and saw Mike's car sitting there in the moonlight, it was like seeing heaven. We sprinted the last 50 feet and piled in, Mike fumbling with the keys so badly that he dropped them on the floor. Tyler was sobbing. Jake was hyperventilating, and I was pressed against the back window, staring into the trees we'd just emerged from. And that's when I saw it. Or at least, I saw something. Just at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden behind a massive fir tree, was a dark shape. Huge, way taller than a person. I couldn't make out features in the darkness, but I could see the outline. Broad shoulders, massive head, standing upright on 2 legs. It was just watching us. Mike finally got the key in the ignition, but instead of starting the car right away, he killed the headlights and interior lights. We sat there in complete darkness, barely breathing. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the shape. They all turned to look. The figure hadn't moved. It was just standing there, partially concealed by the tree. "Is that a person?" Tyler asked, his voice barely audible. "That's not a person," Jake said. "It's way too big." We sat in silence for what felt like forever, but was probably about 20 minutes. None of us wanted to start the car and turn on the lights because we were afraid of provoking whatever was watching us. Eventually, the shape moved, disappearing deeper into the forest. We waited another 5 minutes before Mike finally started the car and peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel. We drove for about an hour in almost complete silence before pulling over at a gas station to process what had happened. We were all shaking, covered in scratches from branches, and missing most of our camping gear. "We have to go back tomorrow," Mike finally said. "My dad will kill me if I lose all that camping equipment." None of us wanted to go back, but Mike was right. Plus, our wallets, phones, and other stuff were still at the campsite. We decided to get a motel room for the night and return at first light, when it would be safer. We barely slept that night. At dawn, we headed back, all of us dreading what we might find, but hoping that in the daylight, we'd realize we'd just scared ourselves over nothing. When we reached the campsite around 7 in the morning, everything was quiet. Birds were singing, sunlight was filtering through the trees. It seemed completely normal and peaceful. But our campsite was trashed. My tent was collapsed. One of the aluminum poles snapped in half like it was nothing. The other tent was intact, but had been moved about 10 feet from where we'd pitched it. The rocks we'd used for our fire pit were scattered across the clearing, and most disturbing of all, there were footprints. They were everywhere around the perimeter of our camp. Huge, barefoot impressions pressed deep into the soft forest floor. They were roughly human-shaped, but massive, at least 18 inches long. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We just stood there, staring at those footprints. There was no denying what we were looking at. No bear or known wildlife could have made those tracks. Sasquatch, Tyler finally said, giving voice to what we were all thinking. We gathered our stuff as quickly as possible, not talking much. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched from the trees, but I never saw anything. Just before we left, Jake found something that made my blood run cold. Tufts of dark, coarse hair caught on a broken branch at the edge of the clearing, about 8 feet off the ground. None of us took a sample. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We loaded up and drove away, and I've never returned to Mount Adams since. For years afterward, we rarely spoke about what happened. It was like we had this unspoken agreement not to bring it up. I still don't know exactly what surrounded us that night. I've read up on Sasquatch encounters since then, and a lot of the details match. The rock throwing, the screams, the circling behavior. But reading about it and experiencing it are two completely different things. What haunts me most isn't just what we saw or heard. It's the feeling I had that night, the absolute certainty that we were being toyed with, that whatever was out there could have easily caught us if it wanted to, that it was intelligent enough to coordinate, to surround us, to communicate with others of its kind. I'm 35 now, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that scream in my dreams. I've never been able to explain what happened to my satisfaction. All I know is that something was out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does.